everybody. Today we are debating gender, sexuality, and religion, and we are starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for another epic debate. As we have returning with us, PapaBird Jake is back in the house. Glad to see you, Jake. And we are stoked for the first time. We have John Doyle here, so we want to give a warm welcome to him as well. Thanks for being here, John. So we are pumped. It is going to be a great time, folks. In fact, if it's your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button, as we've got a lot more debates coming up. Very exciting stuff, including, you'll see at your bottom right, it's going to be wild. It's going to be freaky. We are going to have Destiny and Vosh crossing swords in person. That's going to be in Los Angeles next month. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And want to let you know, we are stoked, folks. I have basically got, thanks so much, got that feedback on the audio. We're on track. Appreciate everybody in the live chat. Thrilled to see you here, and thanks so much for everybody's help. It is always a fun time. So want to let you know, both speakers have their links in the description. I have put them there so that you, if you're listening and you're like, I like that, I want to hear more, you can click on their links and hear more and subscribe. So we really enjoy these guys. We don't want to take any more time. Want to let you know, if you have any questions, fire them into the old live chat. And with that, gentlemen, the floor is yours. Thanks so much again for being here.
Someone on the live chat said that my audio is bad.
I just fixed it. Thanks so much.
Yikes, my bad.
No, that's okay. Don't worry. The floor is all yours, gentlemen. We're pleased and pleasured to have you here. So thanks for being with us.
All right.
All right, cool. Well, I mean,
you seem to have a better understanding of where you want to, I guess.
Yeah. I feel I've seen several of your videos, all of which I strongly dislike, which is that's the nature of this. And they all seem to be rooted in very specifically Christian conservatism, and I find both philosophies to be incredibly flawed, but I figured if we were ever going to talk, we couldn't start anywhere else besides the absolute base of your beliefs and how they contradict with the base of my beliefs, really. So I guess sort of, I mean, I'm happy to also defend myself here, but
how would you define Christian conservatism, just so I kind of know where we're operating?
Well, conservatism that is often heavily flavored and buttressed by belief in the Christian God and the theology there, and usually it's not Catholicism, though that does happen. It's usually more of the
evangelical type.
Yeah, I'd say evangelical, although it doesn't have to be.
Okay. Yeah, so that's interesting. With me, it sort of happened the opposite of what you would probably expect, as far as I was not Christian first and then became conservative. I was raised in a Christian house, but it wasn't really enforced. I went to church every Sunday, but once I got to about like 10, I started to reject it outright. I became an atheist, and I refer to this stepping stone as my edgy atheist phase. I think that most of us go through it. Some of us stay there. Sure. And it wasn't actually until maybe I was about 16 or 17 that I actually started to kind of come back to Christianity, and then maybe within the last year and a half that I actually started to like accept it as a belief system rather than a value system. So basically how that worked, I knew I was conservative by the time I was like 8. So that was kind of already there.
Do you find that striking that you decided what your political beliefs were when you are literally the dumbest type of human? Like 8-year-olds are generally not considered intelligent people, right? We don't look at an 8-year-old and go like, that guy knows what he's thinking. You know what I mean? We go, that guy probably gets angry when he's forced to share. You know what I mean? Like
sort of
like a conservative.
So you're saying that because I was So as I went through that progression, like obviously as like a conservative, whatever, like obviously there was reconsideration of ideas. It wasn't like I cemented this, but I do just kind of want to establish this as precedent. So we're assuming that 8-year-olds are not intelligent and capable of making decisions.
I don't think 8-year-olds are capable of making decisions to flavor the rest of their worldview. It depends. It really depends.
You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, sometimes, but
Okay.
I think
So
you're talking
I
about
just wanted to establish
gender.
this as precedent, since you are saying that 8-year-olds are incapable of making decisions that'll affect the rest of their life, and since this conversation was
No, no,
an
no, no,
action
no, no,
based.
no, 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 no. They are not incapable of making decisions that'll affect the rest of their life. They're generally pretty dumb. So what you do, these are totally different things, right? And I know you don't necessarily think they are, right? Because you're automatically going to the transgender kid thing, right? But one of these things is just preventative in nature, and the other one is like you're using the idea that you were X since 8 as a form of street cred to show that like, oh, I went through my edgy atheist phase at 10, you know what I mean? Like I was over that shit by my teenage years. And you know what I mean? Like it's
No, no, no,
not.
you're missing. Perhaps I didn't articulate this correctly. You're misinterpreting what I was saying. I wasn't saying that I got out of my atheist phase when I was young. Therefore, that's something only young and naive people go through. I was just saying that I, in the timeline of my life, knew I was conservative before I knew that I was Christian. That was like what I was saying. I wasn't trying to imply that any sort of belief set is lesser than.
Right. And a political belief set is not as intrinsic as one's own identity, right? Do you agree or disagree?
I think that they're linked.
You think that someone's identity, like the person they are, is
Yeah, yeah. I think that what we find is ultimately political beliefs are.
Wait,
downstream
so
from
what
values.
what is your what are your conservative political beliefs at 8 years old?
Well, like it was in the beginning of it, so it wasn't, as evolved.
Well, I know,
as it
but I
is
mean, like,
now.
can you even say like, oh, that was that 8-year-old there, that there's going to be a Republican, not because their parents are Republicans or whatever, but because of a specific thought an 8-year-old has?
Yeah, I was fundamentally against the idea of gun control and welfare.
Why? Did
Gun
you understand gun control at 8 years old?
moderately, definitely not as well as I understand it now, but I understood it to the effect that when crises happen, like for example, when I was 12 years old, that was when Sandy Hook happened. That when those happen, the response from the public is often to try and suppress what has ever amplified the underlying causes to be able to perpetuate the way that they have. And so in the Obama administration, for example, they wanted to confiscate AR-15s, or not necessarily confiscate, but they wanted to reinstate the assault weapons ban. And so that was something that I didn't support. I didn't support any general lessening, especially in Michigan, with the gun laws as far as the capacity that citizens.
And why do you think you believed that that shouldn't have taken place? Surely you don't think that you came to that conclusion independently as an 8-year-old and it wasn't flavored by your environment.
We can totally go in this direction. I'm okay with it, but one thing I wanted to clarify, because some people in the live chat were, I don't want to, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that anyone in the live chat listening, the reason that they had mentioned it was kind of implicit, is that John was kind of going in the direction of, if 8-year-olds aren't able to make it, maybe aren't at their best in making their political decisions, then should they be left to decide on things like their gender? And
correct.
So that Jake was giving a rebuttal, and so I just want to, just so people,
the rebuttal is, clearly your political ideas did not come from an intrinsic point, right? You didn't independently think as an 8-year-old without any outside influence that you are pro-gun, right? You had parents. I'm assuming you grew up with guns. I'm assuming you grew up in Michigan with things like hunting, with things like the NRA. You probably went to, did you go to get your hunting license as a child? Like, did you shoot at all?
True.
So because I did all those things, because I did all those things. Did you have guns involved at all at 8 years old in your life?
No.
Okay, so at 8 years old, you have an independent. Explain how it's independent from any outside source.
So that's not what I was saying. You're assuming that political thought.
Okay,
in a consolidation, which it doesn't.
Exactly, and I don't think it does. What I'm saying
that's what you're arguing, because I said that you're.
No, I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing the opposite.
Your values influence your politics.
Correct, but as an 8-year-old, the idea that your politics, your values are given to you by your parents. Do you agree or disagree? Mostly, like you came up with a 2-parent household.
No, I didn't.
Or okay, whichever parent or however that worked, your adult influences. It's usually parents, grandparents, in immediate families. Do you agree or disagree?
Disagree. I think that there's a large component of intrinsic morality, which I'm sure we'll discuss as we get into religion. But I think that is fine-tuned through how you grow up, depending on the presence of mothers and fathers, or depending on the culture in which you grew up in. So I don't think that it's 100%.
So it sounds like your religion runs even deeper than I feared. So, because if you find intrinsic morality to be a thing, that's an even stickier bog we have to walk through.
One thing I just didn't hear, I don't know if the audience might not have either, just the last thing that you had said, John, in literally the last 5 or 6 words.
He doesn't believe that
I don't believe
child's morality
I don't believe that a
is...
child's morality is 100% nature or nurture, basically.
Oh, I see. What you're...
Okay, so which do you think is more flavored?
Probably nature.
You think nature?
Yeah.
You think the nature of a person is born right into them?
Yes.
Okay, so how can you even disagree with anyone that's gay or trans?
Well, okay, so we'll get into
you literally, that doesn't make any sense. If
No,
you're
it
like,
actually
okay,
makes...
a person is this thing.
Bruh, it makes so much sense.
It doesn't make any sense, because what I'm saying is...
You are assuming, your argument is predicated upon the assumption that there is a genetic cause, an unfailing and invariable...
Okay, your argument is predicated upon that there is a magic person that bestows morality upon you.
That's not true.
Just to be
okay, so
sure.
then how is morality intrinsic to a being then?
Can we hold that thought? Can I get back to my 8-year-old point, the first one I was trying to make?
You could try.
All right. So the point that I was trying to make there
seems incredibly
was that,
contradictory, so I'm very...
Go ahead.
So the environment in which I grew up in metropolitan Detroit. I spent a lot of time in the neighborhoods of Detroit. And so I sort of developed the recognition that your right to self-defense is pretty important, and it ultimately relies on you. I don't know what the police response time is in your neck of the woods, but in my neck of the woods, it wasn't all that great. So the environment influenced it to that degree. So that was the point I was trying to make there. But I can also understand how people that didn't grow up in those areas could still obviously develop a sense that, you know, their right to self-preservation is intrinsic and inalienable to them without having to have gone through those specific environmental factors.
Okay. And you don't think at all that... It's interesting to me that you say that that's the case, and that you're also at 8 years old aware of things like the Second Amendment and assault weapons bans and statistics bearing those things out. Like,
I didn't say I was familiar with statistics.
Sure, it just doesn't seem like very honest to say that I had a good handle.
When I was 8 years old, I thought I was Republican, and then you decided to clamp down on that.
Okay, but this is what but this is what I mean. How does an 8-year-old know they're Republican unless outside sources are informing you what a Republican is?
I never said that the outside sources are necessarily what dictates the values. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, wait.
This is exactly what I mean. And that's exactly what I meant before. So I agree with you.
Just to be sure that John was had that all wrapped up. If you needed to
I think we can clear it up. I think there was, I don't know if I didn't articulate myself properly, but I was making the point, there were 2 points that were being made. One was that, I don't even know if you call this a point or just an observation, an anecdote, if you will, that when I was 8, I was Republican. And then I also stated, perhaps incidentally, that your values ultimately influence your politics, but I wasn't trying to make the jump that that is like you are born into conservatism or liberalism based on your genetics.
But do you find so I understand what you're saying. So, and then very quickly you made a sort of 1-to-1 on trans kids and conservative kids, and it's roughly, you're saying that they're deciding to do a thing, right? But
no.
So do you agree that studies show that by about age 3, a child has made a determination on their gender, and it tends to be an intrinsic, inborn thing?
Oh yeah, I agree with that.
By all studies shown? Okay, so then how can you be against it if it's intrinsic?
It's not necessarily that it's intrinsic. Okay, so if we look at, we're talking about the trans studies of the trans kids. So the study that you're citing, you're saying that gender is...
It's not the study, it's multiple studies. It's like dozens and dozens of studies.
Yeah, no, I've read the meta-analysis. So you're saying in this particular one that gender is intrinsic, like gender identity is intrinsic to a child.
Gender identity tends to be very intrinsic to a person, yes, and it tends to manifest early on in age. Relatively 3 years old is 3 to 4 is a good time that they will make a determination on their gender. They might not have words for it, but it typically manifests itself in also expression and the way that they consider themselves. And then as they have people that are more aware of this type of thing, and you have the language for it as it develops over time in society, you have the ability to communicate these things more clearly. But I think, I have seen that research. The problem that I have with that particular conclusion is that we also know that children don't develop a mature understanding of like what it actually means to have a gender identity until the time that they're about 5 or 7. And before that, what I'm sure that you're referring to is typically children, they don't understand the difference between sex characteristics and like gender behavior. So if they see, like, for example, if a young girl sees that boys are behaving in a certain way and she likes to behave in that certain way, maybe she wants to wear clothes that are like the clothes that young boys are wearing, oftentimes she can start to confuse her own gender identity with that of a boy. So the problem with what you're referring to... That could happen, sure.
Yeah.
But is that a bad thing?
Just to hear the rest.
I was going to say the problem with what he's specifically referring to is that now that we do have these gender clinics opening, for example, I think between 2007 and 2017, we had 45 additional ones open in the US. The UK saw 50% gender clinic referrals between 2011 and 2012. The problem is...
I want to nail down something real quick.
Okay.
While that is possible, that doesn't happen. Like, there are no studies that bear that out.
Bear what out?
What you just said. Like, it just doesn't... Like, the idea that someone goes, look at the boys doing boy things. I like boy things. I am a boy. That's not how it works.
That's actually exactly how it works.
No, that's literally not how anyone with dysphoria has ever described their personal situation.
Have you ever read the stories?
Have you ever talked to a trans person?
I have. No, as a matter of fact, I've had.
Okay, good, because you should. Because the story they tell is not the one that you're talking about.
Just hear the case.
The stories of transgender people that have been suppressed are the stories from people that have detransitioned. And, you know, for example, when I gave a speech at Akron, there was a woman there, and what was that?
You're going to give me an anecdote. I don't give a shit about your anecdote.
Well, so that's the thing. It's like, okay, there are different types of evidence that exists. And, you know, that is a particular anecdote. But you can also look up on different forums and blogs, like stories of people that have detransitioned. This is the type of thing that they'll describe.
Do you find forums and blogs to not be anecdotes?
I just want to be sure that he gets the point out, and then I promise we'll come right back to you, Jake.
Is if we know that, and this is according to the APA's Handbook on Sexuality and Behavior, if we know that between 80 and 95% of children displaying symptoms of gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, whichever DSM you'd like, if we know that 80 to 95% of them will outgrow that dysphoria once they've gone through puberty, why would you then want to cement them into that identity, which will make them more likely to develop?
Who's cementing anyone into any identity?
If you put a child through gender affirmation therapy, and I believe the ACLU and HRC currently has 4 steps, basically, if you're a child. So that would start with first a social transition. You know, you change your name and you start to dress in clothes that, I guess, express your gender better, whatever. And then you would start to, if you're at the appropriate age, you would start to take puberty blockers. And then from that point, once you're, I think, 16 is the age that they recommend, then you would take cross-sex hormones. Then finally at 18, the final step of that would be to get a sex assignment.
Sure.
Or sex reassignment surgery. And so what I'm saying is that what we found out is that of the children that start to go through that path, specifically with the puberty blockers and the cross-sex hormones, virtually none of them later decide that they would like to opt out of that transition and, you know, identify with their biological sex, which is another thing I'd like to ask you at some point is how you feel about biological sex.
So this would imply that people that go through gender confirmation and go through transition in general, which is what we typically call it, are happy with the result.
Not necessarily, because we have data that says it's not. But no, that is a correct interpretation. You could assume from that it means that 100% of the people...
Not 100%. I'm sure there's no way 100% of anybody likes being the thing they are or tried to be or anything like that.
Right.
The difference is, right, is because there seems to be this concrete notion of
I hate to interrupt. Forgive me. Just I think
you are definitely interrupting.
I definitely am, but but for the purpose of the audience, I think it's that you guys are so familiar with the everything that's going on that you'll sometimes like read each other's minds, and you're kind of like a step ahead to where some of the people, I think if you guys can just lay out the basic of kind of where we're at right now.
So the basic idea of being trans? Do you want that? I mean, I'm genuine. I'll give it to you. I give it to you. I just don't know where I don't know what is basic for you. I have this conversation.
No, that's not what I mean. I mean more like where the conversation is going in the sense that, so John named these ways in which he's suggesting that there are 4 steps, I think, by the ACLU in which you're kind of cementing a person's gender. And then
the ACLU doesn't determine someone's gender. The ACLU just tends to support this kind of steppage.
That wasn't what I meant. I could find the particular organization. I think
the ACLU isn't who bestows gender upon you.
Well, I mean, that's definitely not what I was saying.
I believe it was the ACLU worked with the Human Rights Campaign, and then there was another acronym, forgive me for forgetting, but it was kind of complicated because it didn't like make its own little word. But they had laid out a policy prescription for the 4 steps that you should take if you want to give a child a healthy transition from their, I guess, sex assigned at birth is the language, to their gender identity. And that would start with a social transition, which would be the child starts school again, because they take them out of school for a little bit and then put them back, and they let all the teachers know that, okay, this child is coming back, is this gender, these are their pronouns, this is their name. Everyone should kind of get on the same page with that, and you shouldn't bully them, you shouldn't belittle them or make them feel different about it. And then that child will also start to be referred to by those pronouns and by those names, by their family and everyone in their life, basically. And then they're also going to start to express that gender identity in ways that were different from before they started that. And then the next step would be, depending on their age, like at the age at which they start this transition, would be to put them on not cross-sex, that's step 3, puberty blocking drugs. So basically what that would do is it would stop the natural cycle of puberty from occurring in the child if that cycle is, it would be in this case, if it contradicts their gender identity, basically. And so the idea there—
And that happens typically right before puberty would normally happen.
Yeah. And so
it is totally reversible.
Not true. So basically what they want to do, it's not. That's okay. Hold on his point, then I'll let him respond. So when they say that it's true, that is true in the sense that you can take these puberty blockers, and then if you later decide that you don't want to identify with that gender identity, you can stop taking them, and then puberty will happen. The problem is, by that time, let's say that you take the puberty blockers when you're, if you're a young girl, let's say you're 7 or 8 years old when you take them. Say you decide at 14,
you wouldn't take them at 7 or 8.
Say you decide at 14 that you want— when does puberty start in a girl?
You wouldn't take it at 7 or 8 necessarily. It tends to be like between 10 and 12.
Okay, not 8, 10. So if a young girl starts taking them at 10, and then she decides that she doesn't want to identify with that gender anymore for whichever reason, and then she tries to resume puberty later in life, not only is that pubertal cycle going to be delayed by however many years, relative to her peers and how they have progressed, she will be different, and she's not going to look like a young girl. She's basically going to look like a child who is slightly elongated, but her growth has still been stunted. So the idea that it can just be reversed and undone isn't true, because to pervert the process by even halting it in the first place, like the natural biological process, is to already stunt it in the sense that it would have normally progressed. And then with the cross-sex hormones, that's like if you're a woman but you want to identify as a man. I'm not sure what Jake's particular views are on as far as how many genders there are, but assuming these—
How many genders are there?
2.
Okay.
So is that the framework from which we're operating? Do you think that there
I 100% disagree, but
okay, I didn't want to be like one of those, oh, he thinks how many like that wasn't what I was trying to do. I'm trying to like seriously establish a—
I would love to talk. I mean, you seem to be talking a lot. Is chat caught up now? Can we continue? Or?
Do you think that just before I go through that, do you think that there are like 56, I think was the Facebook, or do you think that like there's a spectrum or there's infinite, basically, and it's just up to the individual?
Both sex and gender are a spectrum, though most people end up in the binary, because that's— first of all, in sex, because it's bimodal, it does have a spectrum, but we tend to obviously have specific primary and secondary sex characteristics, some different combinations. We have effeminate men and masculine women who are cisgendered and have their normal primary, but not necessarily a secondary. And gender itself is an interesting conversation, and it's pretty cool. What it means to be a man is not the same as what it means to be a man to me, as what it means to be a man to Jim, as what it means to be a man to you, as what it means to be a man in Africa, as what it means to be a man in Japan. So while we can make these like really rudimentary sort of things, and they're kind of useful for language right now, like you can say to a cop, "Oh, a man assaulted me." So everyone assumes right now, the way we use language, a masculine person assaulted this person and they're looking for a man. But if that person ends up having a vagina, the language it wasn't accurate, but it was still useful. Until it's no longer useful, we'll use terms like that. But when it becomes unuseful, we will say, "Oh, a masculine person with whatever other attributes, or a feminine person with whatever attributes. Oh, this person was kind of androgynous and they did that." And not just for police reports, but for anything necessarily, like a casting call, whatever you're looking for.
What do you think the timeline on that is going to be?
You think the timeline on the social change of that is going to be?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, probably a couple generations. It just depends, because the way it is, like I'm a cis straight white guy. Like we're probably very similar in that regard. Like I feel very comfortable being a man. I feel comfortable identifying as such. I feel comfortable other people identifying as such. But I know for a fact that there are aspects of masculinity and my expectations as a man that, I think are kind of silly. Like I don't think necessarily it's reasonable to expect me to want to be incredibly aggressive. I don't think it's necessarily like there's this idea that you and I should have this sort of alpha of the wolf pack mentality at times. Not all the time, of course. Like there's being cordial to one another and stuff like that. But and other things. But that's a conversation about things like toxic masculinity and things like that.
So do you think that masculinity is basically a social construct in the sense that we're societally conditioned to believe that this is the ideal which we're supposed to strive towards?
Oh yeah, there are definitely societal ideals, of course, that all people are, regardless of masculinity, and depends on the society, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, a person in some place might be considered more effeminate. There are jokes like oh, French guys are more effeminate than American red-blooded males. You know what I mean? And it's not because they're actually ladies. It's because there are societal norms that are a little bit different. They wear they're a little bit skinnier. They wear a little bit different clothing. They tend to have a little bit different fashion, maybe longer hair, stuff like that. And so we, as whatever culture we happen to be, see them as a little bit different. And this is an example of just societal differentiation. But that said, it makes sense that we organized by sex for a long time. It doesn't seem to be super societally useful long term. It seems to be useful right now, but it doesn't seem societally useful down the road as people experiment with what they want to be called, what their expectations might be, how they want to express a myriad of different things.
Why do you think that it was useful to organize society by sex initially up until...
Well, do you believe in evolution, John?
It depends. I mean, that's
okay. So evolutionary is the answer. So there is a sex of this human species that has babies, and it takes 9 months of that, and then it takes years and years after that, because we're feeble, bad at doing things babies for quite some time, and the person that makes babies tends to be making more babies while they're taking care of other babies. So there happened to be one group that wasn't making these babies, and they started doing more of the other stuff. And as we evolve to be better at what we do. So the people that weren't having babies had to make sure that through natural selection and selection pressure and things like this, that they had to be good at hunting. They had to be a little bit more physical, and the ones that weren't died out. And so you tend to see the male sex tends to be a little bit physically stronger, but we can't have kids. You tend to see the female sex have their birth canals have changed over time. The way we reproduce in general, kind of our sex organs have changed. You can see like something as rudimentary as like length of penis and emission levels like change over time based on the culture and the area and the geography that you're at. It's a whole bunch of different shit. So evolution is the answer to that.
So we used to have, through evolution, I guess, an objective standard that we could categorize humans, right? Because we had men and women based off their organization for the capacity.
You still do, male and female.
Yeah. So
Sexist.
I guess what I'm wondering in the future, what objective categorization would you foresee 2 generations from now, if not male and female, or if not biological sex?
It'd be your primary sex organs, your penis and testicles, and your vagina and your ovaries and all the other.
So the design of your body,
that would be the objective way to organize anyone. Other than that, there's not really much objectivity, because not everybody fits into those norms. I mean, we've had these people for years. Like there's a guy I worked at. My first job was McDonald's, and there was this very masculine looking guy that sounded like a lady, like a very, very young woman through the drive-through. And everyone would warn the kid in drive-through, like, hey, don't call this person a ma'am because he doesn't like it. And he'd come through and he's got a big old bushy beard and he sounds like a little girl, and it's really weird. Like these things happen, and it's not and that's just an example of a cis person just displaying an abnormal thing we don't societally expect. This is not a bunch of people just going, you know what, I kind of don't fit into the way people view X. I think I feel much more comfortable when people refer to me as Y, whatever that is.
So,
and I see no problem with it at all.
You would still make the case then for biological sex as defined by your capacity for reproduction through either donating genetics or receiving genetics? I think that's what you said, as far as that would always be objective, like penises and vaginas is your particular language.
I mean, insofar as what they are born with, most likely, and not just penises and vaginas, but you'd have to go deeper, because There are people with penises and vaginas that don't have the same chromosomes as the majority of people that do have those things. So I mean, again, sex is bimodal. It's as close to objective as you can get. But again, there's so many variants in the human body and mutations and things like that, and things that aren't mutations that are just not as normal as the standard. So yeah, like as close to being objective as you can get. You can say someone's height, someone's skin color, someone's eye
You seem
color,
to be alluding to
sex,
disorders of sexual development as if they're differences.
No. I'm not talking about someone. No. I'm not talking someone.
You mentioned people with different sets of chromosomes and both.
Yes, those are not always like, okay. So I'm not talking about like hermaphroditism, where you have multiple sets of gonads or whatever, and one of them might be a little more vestigial than the other. I'm talking about literally there are just normal people, and you might be one. I don't know. Have you had your chromosomes checked out? You might be one where instead of was it XY for men, and XY for ladies? Is that what it is? Is that what you believe?
XX for women, XY for men.
Sure. So it's not always the case. Sometimes XXY, sometimes XYX.
Yeah, like, those are referred to as DSDs. Those occur, I think.
And they can be. They absolutely
those are. Like 1 out of every 5,000 births is like a DSD, and that is what results in the ambiguous external genitalia, the mismatch between the internal.
No. They're not always ambiguous, though. Sometimes that person will live their entire lives being perfectly masculine or feminine.
I said it can result in that ambiguity.
Sure, but I want to make sure that that the audience who didn't understand what we were talking about earlier understands this, that you, person in the audience right now, might be this person with these chromosomes that you might not think you have, and you've lived perfectly normal your entire life, and it will never affect you. So it might come up in like genetic.
What do you think the cause of those disorders is?
What do you think? What do you think the cause of those disorders?
Yeah, like what causes those DSDs?
I mean, just changes in DNA over time. Do you want me to call them mutants?
No, I was just saying that we know that there is a normal way for human beings to develop when they're in the womb, and those particular disorders are caused by chromosomal or hormonal defects that occur when the child is in the womb. And so we know that those are abnormal, those are atypical circumstances because something happened, something was wrong during the pregnancy.
Well, sure, but what? Sure, I guess in that they're not the majority, they're abnormal, but they're not so abnormal that they're rare, right? Like it's very common, 1 in 5,000. So I mean, like that's a lot of people. That's not like a little amount. That's not a small population. And so the idea here is that, not that I want to say that this is a lot, like the majority of people, just that it happens so often that people walk around with these all the time, and it never
seem to be
really
using that to sort of allude to an idea that biological sex is like the best that we have now, but it's kind of, there are exceptions to it. For
biological sex does have exceptions. 1 in 5,000 people are the exception. So the idea
that's actually not an exception in the sense that like it invalidates biological sex, because those
I never said it invalidated biological sex. I think biological sex is perfectly valid, and whatever you got going on is reasonable. But if someone has a sex change, you're not going to be able to rely on those years down the road. But as what they were born with, you could be like, well, this person was born with these gonads or whatever, so this is what happens. If down the road you can end up having I don't know, would it be gonadal, whatever. If you could implant ovaries or testes and they were working and would result in procreation in people, it would become much less reliable to even talk about. So I mean, it just depends on where we're at in medical science, and right now we can't reliably. Trans people can't reliably have kids.
So you think that, just so I'm clear, that there are 2 biological sexes and then gender is a different concept?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are 2 major biological sexes, of course, but it is bimodal. It is
okay.
It is, of course. Of course, it is a spectrum, but it's not a spectrum you get to choose until you decide to later, right? Does that make sense? Like you can choose. You could choose as an adult to, like. I can't think of a. Are you for freedom, John? Are you a freedom guy?
Not unfailingly.
You don't like freedom?
No. I like freedom. But I know where you're getting at, the stereotypical freedom kind of conservative, but that's not really me.
Okay, it's dangerous Richard Spencer territory. Please don't go that far.
Really not. I'm not Richard Spencer, but
I know you're not. I'm saying that he also started there, and so I'm just hoping someday, 5 years down the road, I don't have to watch you cut your beautiful hair off. So, what I'm saying is that I think bodily freedom is super important. We should allow people to do whatever they want with it.
Kind of want to return to that point. So you said that there are 2 major biological sexes?
I'd say the majority of people lie on either the natural female sex organs.
Okay,
or natural
I just
male
kind of
sex
want to
organs.
explain
But of
to
course,
you
there are people
my interpretation of it and see if we
Okay.
disagree. So the way I see it is that biological sex is basically grounded in the organism's organization for reproduction. And so because someone who is intersex doesn't have different or they don't have some sort of third gonad, if you will, they basically have defective reproductive organs that we would see on a normal male or typical female. So there's basically no.
Sometimes one works just fine and the other one is vestigial or largely incomplete.
Okay, but even then, I would say that there is no like third sex, because there's only the like
intersex is considered a sort of a third sex in that way.
But even with the example that you gave, like one can function and one can't. Like one still functions. One is either the donating genetic factor or the receiving genetic factor. So it exists within the concept of the sexual binary as far as biological sex is considered.
I want to say that I don't know that it is 100% true that all the time one of those organs is entirely unable to do things. But I will say that largely people tend to fit into either having a working set of male sex organs and working set of female sex organs. Again, I mean, whatever sex you are is, I mean, trans people don't really deny their sex. I've never heard a trans person in my life say, I am not this sex. They say, I'm not this gender, and I want to change the physical presentation of my sex.
They typically just say, I am this sex, right?
Well, gender.
Okay, because you mentioned another thing about
it's very changing
biological sex. That's another thing I want to get to, the differences between gender and sex. But you mentioned that adults can change their biological sex. I was wondering if you could expand upon how exactly that process works.
When you say biological sex, do you mean sex they were born with?
Yeah.
Okay, so no, you can't. What you can do is change the presentation of it. So I could take...
So that's decidedly different, though.
Yes, of course. And I don't think any trans person has ever said that they've... Because they don't use sex change as a term. That's kind of like a crass sort of like...
I believe it's called sex reassignment therapy, or surgery, rather.
Most people call it gender confirmation or gender affirmation. But some do say SRS and sex reassignment. But that's because the sex organs are being reassigned to represent the other sex organs. Typically. I have literally never met a trans person that has gone through or wishes to go through transition that has ever described to me denying the actual sex they were born with as like like dismissing the fact that they were born with X. The literal idea behind being trans is putting a spotlight on the sex you were born with and going, I don't like that.
Yeah. Okay. So do you think that it's a mental disorder?
Do I think what is a mental disorder?
Do you think that feeling an incongruence between your biological sex and your gender identity is a mental disorder? Because what you just said actually highlights something that I think is pretty interesting.
Dysphoria is a mental disorder. It's a mental illness, rather.
Right.
Calling it a disorder is again one of those things that a lot of people like to do to try to sort of dismiss the importance, but so is PTSD, like the veterans have, and depression that a lot of people have, and I think we should make sure that we help people with mental illness and mental. Just any sort of mental deficiency at all.
Yeah, I've mentioned that before on my channel too, because I don't like the way that a lot of conservatives go about this issue as far as using mental disorder pejoratively to sort of belittle these people, because I don't think that's constructive. However, I do think that we should call things what they are, which is why I've always referred to it as a mental disorder, despite using that as sort of a preface. But I do think it's interesting that you highlighted the dysphoria as like the problem. So I think that a lot of people that tend to steer away from the problem of this being like a mental illness, they pretend that the dysphoria is caused, for example, by societal backlash or intolerance against their gender identity. But I think
okay, so there are two parts to this. So I don't mean to totally cut you off, but we got to stop right there. So gender dysphoria is not caused necessarily by people being like, you're not the thing you are. The side effects of dysphoria, the main side effect of dysphoria is feeling a incredible incongruence between how you feel and how you are, right? And wanting to fix that, wanting to make a change. It's like saying that shooting bottle rockets off at a veteran causes PTSD. Do you understand? It doesn't. It triggers the PTSD, right? Like it's totally. Do you understand what I'm saying here?
Oh, I understand, but you acknowledge.
Do you agree?
Yeah, but you acknowledge at least what I'm saying is because oftentimes what we're told, I don't know if you necessarily hold this belief, but the media cycle basically tells us that if we would be more affirming to these people as a society, that their suicide attempt rate, for example, would not be as high. So I think that we could actually agree that, in the sense that there is some
social acceptance by people at large, when there is like millions of people at the time accepting you as a person, absolutely is shown to help people. Yes, just look at gay suicide statistics as we move towards Obergefell v. Hodges. Yes,
right. So I guess what I was saying is, so do you think that the only affirmation can only come through traditional therapies that have been advocated for? Like, would you, for example, advocate in favor of it's referred to as conversion therapy, but it's not conversion therapy, but I think you would
you're talking about like pray the gay away?
No, I'm talking about like if someone has gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, do you think that the way to help them is to have them go through the hormones and the affirmation surgery, or do you think that they would bear like better in therapy, like traditional therapy?
So as far as the affirmation surgery, not every trans person wants that, right? Some people don't have an incongruence with their sex organs. It's rather their outward, the other parts, their secondary sex characteristics. Some can be both, some can be just one. Some can maybe only want to take their genitals and change them and not change the rest. So I mean, like as far as some of that, it's not an all-encompassing thing. Some trans people don't even necessarily not like their appearance. They don't like their societal standing in the way that they're labeled and stuff like that. So I mean, like it's much more complex than just like man cut off pee-pee, you know what I mean? So what was the second part of your question?
I was asking if you would advocate...
What's the best treatment?
Yeah.
Okay, so the best treatment, according to medical professionals worldwide, is to go through transition. And there are different steps, like you mentioned, societal, and there's also physical. And to whatever extent that person will be alleviated of their dysphoria is the correct course, right? So if that person is not feeling at home inside their own body, there has to be changes made, and that person is the one that gets to decide. And that's just how it works. I don't know how we can tell people not to feel comfortable because they make us uncomfortable. Like, I see a bearded lady, like I'm a trans advocate, and my first reaction to see a bearded lady, because I don't see that very often, would be to look twice. And then I go, oh, okay, that's a lady with a beard. And then I'd stop, right? Because it's not normal yet. It's not normalized. But as we move to normalize things, as we've normalized things like being gay, lesbian, whatever, it stops becoming a thing. It stops becoming a thing we even think about. Oh, you're gay, cool. Anyway, you want to go play basketball, dude? And then yes. So like that's just how it works.
Yeah. So the reason I asked was because I think it was the Endocrine Society. They released their guidelines for how they thought that the best prescription they thought for transgenders to undergo.
Transgenders.
What should I call them?
Transgendered people, or yeah, that's fine.
Okay, transgender people.
Transgenders is another crass term that often gets tossed around by people that just aren't informed on it, and you sound like you desire to be informed on it. So
okay, so transgender people, and basically it even included in this report. Hi.
Yeah, that's Ellie.
Anyway, it included in the report that the conclusions which it was drawing from were basically based on bad data. And so this is something, I'm not trying to like confront you with like my facts and logic, but this is something that I just kind of like to run by you, because I've read studies and meta-analyses of different studies that basically say that for that particular treatment, as far as going through the hormones and the surgery and everything, basically the data is bad in the sense that the sample sizes are very small, it's non-random, and they lose track of the patients. I think there was one where they lost track of like literally half of the respondents. So there are no long-term studies that can affirm whether or not this is helpful. So all the data we have is either bad, but then there was one study, which I think is actually the largest and the most thorough, which comes to us from Sweden, and it said that it was like decidedly not good. And you had stuff like they were 19 times higher than the general population after surgery to experience suicidal thoughts. They were 5 times as likely to actually commit suicide. There were some other things like that, but I'm wondering, do we have enough data? Like, do you think we have enough data to like cement this as like, this is exactly what trans people should be doing? This is definitely what our kids should be doing. You're grinning.
It's because you cited the Dutch study. Yeah. No, that happens.
What's wrong with the Dutch study?
The Dutch study proves that most people are happier with it, but it's whatever. You're not, I mean.
The one from Gothenburg?
I believe I know it as the Dutch study. I don't really think about it as the Gothenburg study. Is the Gothenburg study the Dutch study that I always have to read? Is that the one?
That was the one with the rate of psychiatric hospitalization 3 times the general population, even adjusted for prior psychiatric treatment. The risk of mortality from all causes increases along with criminal convictions, suicide attempts 5 times, or suicide is actually 5 times as high. Likelihood of death by suicide
happier, 7% of the same. The rest
times as
think
high.
it's worse. What year?
Hold on, let me pull it up. Let's see. I think it was 2011.
Oh, was it the 70s?
Wait a
God,
minute.
I hope not.
Okay, here, yeah. So we've got. It started in the 70s, but like I said, this is a longitudinal study. So this was 1973 to 2003.
Okay.
Yeah, long term. Can we put this in a chat somewhere?
And it also says that societal factors played a large part. And
no, that you're right. But the problem with that is that they played a large part in the sense that obviously anybody that's subject to discrimination or bullying is going to be more likely to feel depressed or commit suicide or attempt suicide than someone who's not. But the thing is what we find is even in Sweden, which is a country that's pretty tolerant towards trans people, at least relative to the United States, or at least more tolerant, is that these symptoms don't necessarily go away. So like the suicide rate baseline, even among those who don't report that it's because of societal discrimination or condemnation or whatever, their baseline suicide is still so much higher than that of the general population. That
so
it really
did the overall suicide rates and suicidal thought rates fall or stay the same or grow?
I don't know if it says in the study, but I think of trans people post-surgery, it does say, they were 5 times higher and 19 times higher as far as the...
higher than other trans people?
No, so the suicide attempts were 5 times as frequent.
Yeah, it's the suicide attempts thing, yeah.
And we see it in the United States too. So I guess what I'm wondering is, why do you think that gender dysphoria seems to be so inseparable from suicide attempts and depression and anxiety and all these other symptoms?
Okay, so there's 2 reasons. One of them is societal, which we talked about, which if you are not accepted by your peers, there is a likelihood that you will experience depression and not want to be around, right? Mm-hmm. Another big reason is incredibly uncomfortable. It's just devastatingly uncomfortable to be in a body that you don't feel like you should be. There are people who have described it like wearing a heavy coat that you can never take off no matter what, and you're always hot. There are people who have, consider the lengths people go through to rid themselves of the effects of dysphoria, right?
Yeah, no.
Do you think that those people are doing it like kind of flippantly, or?
I never suggested that, but I mean, we see.
I know you didn't. But what I'm saying is, like, when we see someone with any disorder, right, whatever it may be, and we see the behavior they take in efforts to alleviate it, even including and up to suicide attempts, right? I think it would behoove us to take that pretty seriously. And then after the fact, we find out that most people tend to be happy after they are socially accepted, after they go through transition, and after they take the steps, right? And this is like just overwhelmingly true. And apparently the control group for this study was cis people and not other trans people. Which
that's exactly what I said, because
that shouldn't be the case. So the idea should be trans people that have not yet transitioned should be the control group versus trans people that have transitioned. Right.
That was if we wanted to establish a different conclusion from the study. Like a lot of people, they interpret the study, which is I'm sure what your chat thinks that I'm doing or people like me do. So they'll try and draw a conclusion from it, like it's the surgery and these processes that are actually causing them to commit suicide. What I'm saying
is... Okay, so why are you citing it?
Right. So I'm citing it because the reason that we should pay attention to it isn't because it's necessarily causing them to commit suicide. But what I'm saying is it doesn't make them happier after, since they're still more likely than other trans people to want to do it. So
but that's not what the study shows, because the study doesn't show what other trans people feel. It only shows what trans people feel in regards to other cis people after transition. It still also is going from 1973 to 2003. Which are not years in which they are societally accepted. And only within the last 5 years have you really been having this discussion at large as a society. And only in the last maybe 2 years have these people been thrust forward enough to be able to be public and happy all the time, given some exceptions like celebrities.
So the point would be that the symptoms are not being alleviated even after going through. So that would be...
That's not what the study is showing, though. The study is showing that trans people are still sadder and more prone to suicide than cis people, which is true.
Even after going through the processes.
Yes.
So you cited a two-pronged factor. You said that it's not only because of the dysphoria, which you said could be cured by going through these therapies and going through these transitions, and then also because of society.
Well, hold on.
We've eliminated one as an option.
No. Hold on. After you transition, after you get medical transition, right? After you decide that, hey, I want to do this, right? There are still other factors that could be dysphoric for you. For instance, being fucking misgendered constantly, right? Maybe just because you got your bottom surgery, it doesn't mean that necessarily you still present as feminine or masculine or whatever as you wish. Because some people just have a hard time and they feel the need to what we call pass, right? And if they feel the need to pass and don't feel that they're meeting those standards, even after transitioning, having bottom surgery, they're still going to feel dysphoric. So of course they're still going to be unhappy to some extent, but not as unhappy as before necessarily. And because it's really hard for trans people, especially in the 70s up till 2003, like George Bush was still president.
We've also got data though that shows, I think as recently as 2014, that even after the post-op surgery, the suicide rate increases by 1 or 2 percentage points. And that was another thing I kind of wanted to run by you. One of the data points that I frequently cite is that the suicide rate for transgender people who self-describe their gender identity as having no negative impact on their quality of life is still about 1 in 3.
What study is that?
That's from the Brookings Institute, or no, I'm sorry, not Brookings. What is it? Williams Institute at UCLA.
Because every single time this comes up, I look it up and it happens to be debunked. Can someone just give me that in chat so I don't have to Google while we're talking? Because I feel like I've done this a million times, and every single time. That study is 10 years older than countrywide same-sex marriage. Williams Institute does not have a timeline. Okay. I didn't know we were going to talk about trans people the whole time, but I mean, like, we can. Now, which one do I gotta click there? That's just so much. It doesn't have a timeline at all.
So let's see.
Williams Institute does not say when people report suicide attempts, before or after.
I've got the study and it does.
It's just lifetime.
Hold on, you have to scroll down to the table.
Oh, this is the same one. This is the same one that Justin had to go through, guys. Yeah, no. It says it's lifetime. Yeah, I've read this one, the one with the yellow front page. Yep.
So why do you think it's bad data? Because it's lifetime and doesn't necessarily establish it?
Yes, it doesn't establish at all that after the transition it has anything to do with suicide rates. It just says, again, trans people tend to have higher suicide rates than cis people because they do. We know this. It doesn't say that after transition those rates increase.
So why do you think that they're higher than those who haven't had it?
They're not. It doesn't show that.
Lifetime suicide, transition-related healthcare.
It even says in the study you cannot talk about after or before transition in regards to suicide attempts.
So if you look at
it says it in the study.
So if you look at table 5,
okay,
there's like 40% for those who've had or just want hormone treatment. Those who have had it, it's 45%. Why do you think that is?
One hormone treatment for 45%.
Hormone treatment, table 5.
One hormone treatment?
No, I said that those who have had hormone treatment, they got a 40%. For those who want it, and then for those who have had it,
do not want it, have had it.
So, yeah, so I'm wondering, like, why do you think that there's that increase?
Well, I could definitely tell you why that might be an increase by people that have had a hormone prescription, and it seems like most of those people, 16. First of all, it's a larger sample size, so it literally triples the rest of them. Combined.
So talking about proportions though.
Right. So you have a larger sample size of trans people in general, and you're going to find that a lot of trans people tend to be treated like shit. So it depends on where all those people are from. It depends on their individual living situations. But people that are having hormone treatment are going through transition, and during transition might be, according to pretty much all the trans people I talk to, is like incredibly dysphoric, because you're now taking hormones. You're trying to present as say I was going through transition, right? I would be trying, and I wanted to be a binary trans woman, and so I would be trying to present more feminine than recently, but my facial hair hasn't gone away, so I still have stubble. I still have more of a manly figure, but I'm still trying to take steps in order to alleviate my dysphoria. That could absolutely be a major cause, but the study doesn't mention any of it, so we're both wildly speculating.
So the most important figure from that statistic that I'd still like to hear your opinion on was the one about the quality of life.
Do not want to have had lifetime suicide attempts. I have to read that again because I don't know. My chat is saying that they do not rise at all, and I'm wondering.
I'm talking about
percentage of response who reported a lifetime suicide attempt overall showed little variability by current gender identity, as defined by respondents' answers to the question, "What is your primary gender identity today?" So one exception was seen among those who described themselves as part-time as one gender, part-time as another. Perceived recognition by others as transgender, gender nonconforming was also examined as possibly contributing to variation in lifetime suicide attempt rates among NTDS responses. So the thing I just said literally is the first thing the study cites.
Right. I'm wondering on page 14, because it still says that because I'm trans or gender nonconforming, life in general is much improved, somewhat improved, the same, somewhat worse, whatever. So the baseline for even much improved is 39%. Some people that say it's the same is like 31%. So that it has no effect on their life is still like about 1 in 3. So
because I am trans.
You're trans?
No, I'm not trans. No. I'm saying, I'm reading, because I am trans. You're saying the suicide attempts. I don't know why we're reading this again. People who pursue treatment are more likely to have attempted suicide at some point in their lives, which means before getting treatment. Yeah.
What page are you on? Because I don't think we're reading the same thing.
The prevalence of lifetime suicide attempts was lowest among respondents who felt that being transgender and gender nonconforming had not markedly affected their quality of life. Those who felt their life was much worse because they were transgender or gender nonconforming had a much higher prevalence. Yeah, of course they did.
Yeah, right.
Because they have a negative experience being trans.
So what I'm wondering is why best case scenario, as it's much improved because of it, or even no effect on it, it's still about 40% or about 33% or 31% specifically. So like, why do you think it's so high? Because we know that the baseline is about 4.6% for normal people, but then for these people, it's much higher. So I'm wondering, why do you think that is?
I'm interested in why the suicide statistics even matter to you.
I think it matters because I think that what I'm trying to get at, and because like, I don't know how you view me as far as how I view these people, but I don't have any sort of ill will towards them. I think that basically the conversation is being allocated in a direction that it shouldn't be. In my opinion, I think that the best way that we can help these people, because I do believe that they're suffering, is not to pursue reassignment therapies and hormones. I think that they need therapy. And so the reason that it matters,
that's part of what happens when you get gender. So you do you know
I think that
do you know what it takes to transition?
Yeah, I went through the process, but what I'm saying is I think that the suicide rate is...
You went through the process of transitioning?
I went through the process of explaining it. I think that
No. Do you know what it takes to be prescribed hormones and stuff like that in order to
you do. I know you have to go through therapy.
So you do have to go through therapy, and then the therapist has to sign off, and then a secondary medical professional also has to sign off and agree that this person's best outcome of life and their pursuit of happiness, the most medically viable option for them is to transition.
I believe the medical, doctors do that, but I don't think
this is medical consensus. What qualifications do you have to disagree with medical consensus?
So that's an argument from authority. The thing
it's not really an argument from authority. It's what does John Doyle from middle of nowhere, Michigan, like, what's your expertise to go, this is why I disagree? Like, from what basis do you disagree?
There are other medical professionals within that field that have tried to offer another side of this.
But by no means the consensus. That's just like saying that flat earthers are there are scientists that are flat earthers that are throw a varying degree of into the 99% that agree that it's not a flat earth. Same thing with global warming people, same thing. Yep. I mean,
So what I was saying is that those scientists who have had dissenting opinions towards this narrative have been.
Why are we valuing dissenting opinions in regards to scientific consensus?
No, but the scientific consensus is not actually rooted in science. If you actually read like what goes on in these institutions, because I've read the story, like I know what goes on. Are you familiar with the process of like even dating back to 73 in the APA? Like it's not a result of new data. It's a result of political action groups and political interests gaining traction within these institutions to change the language. For example, with the DSM. If you go from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, when they changed what gender identity is to gender dysphoria, that wasn't because of new data. And if you even look at the language, they changed the meaning of sex to be the sex assigned at birth, like little politicized language like that. That was not done because of an introduction of new science or new data. That was done because of the cultural shift that influenced the institutions and the framework of them.
When was the DSM-5 written and published?
It was 2013, something like that.
Mm-hmm. And do you think we were having the trans conversation in 2013 and the years leading up to 2013 between the DSM-4 and 1980 and the DSM-5?
I don't think the DSM. Maybe it is 1980.
I'm pretty sure the DSM-4 was
no, but
published in 1980.
This conversation has been going on much longer than just after.
Yeah, trans people like Harvey Milk and like the intersectionality of the LGBT movement, sure. But no, this has been not in political spheres.
Yeah, correct.
Not really.
Political spheres, but this has been going on.
Yeah, but okay, so you agree it hasn't been in political spheres, but you say that they bent to political pressure.
Okay,
so what is it? Was it not a political sphere topic, or did they bend to political?
It doesn't have to be introduced into the mainstream political atmosphere for people to have these ideologies and then infiltrate these institutions.
So do you think they have the ideologies, these scientists have these ideologies because it makes them feel good that trans people exist? Or do you think they have these ideologies because they looked at the scientific data and went, well, that's a thing. I guess we should treat dysphoria with the treatment for dysphoria.
Right, so I think that they have a bias that sort of leads.
Are there any other diseases or mental disorders that you think people are politically motivated to change the way we treat people?
Again, because you disagree with the meta-analysis, which I've cited, but we have no conclusive
I disagree
evidence.
with the meta-analysis because you are interpreting it incorrectly. You said that the Williams suicide.
That's not a meta-analysis. I'm still talking about if we know conclusively that this surgeries and hormones and everything is the best treatment for these people, which we don't know. There's no data on it.
So was it DSM-3 in 1980 then, chat? From 1980, DSM-3 probably then it had been a cited medical issue. We do know that.
DSM-3 was 80.
DSM-3 was 1980 then. It was one of them. But since 1980.
4 was 1994, and then with the update in 2000, then 5 in 2013. Okay, yeah, so sometime between roughly 2000 or the late 90s and 2013, they changed the language and the classification for what we now understand as gender dysphoria.
Right, so, and you're making the argument that there was like heavy political pressure from like hyper lefties on scientists and medical professionals in spheres that write the DSM. What? That's your claim? Like, do you have any evidence to back that up at all? Do you have literally anything to back that up at all, or is it just conjecture?
No, it's not conjecture. So if you look at, like, for example, with what happened with homosexuality, they infiltrated the APA to declassify that as a mental disorder.
Okay, who infiltrated the APA?
You can Google it right now. They called themselves the Gay PA. That was their nickname.
Who infiltrated? So infiltrated, or were there gay members of the APA?
There were gay members of the APA who then
infiltrated it?
I mean, technically, that's what we're talking about.
Is it what we're talking about if gay people happen to be members of the APA? Do you think that it makes... Okay, so would you say that it makes sense that gay issues would come up and be more likely to be classified if gay people were part of the process of classification?
Yeah, that's my point. It wasn't necessarily
because straight people wouldn't be thinking about that necessarily?
Right, so it's not because that we had conclusive science. It was because of the political backlash.
That is conclusive science.
No, I mean, there are books written about this. You can look at it. I believe it's referred to as the 81 words. There was an entire process about how it was reclassified, and it had nothing to do with new evidence or anything. And so what happened is that momentum and the influence of those narratives and of those people continued to propagate within the institution. And so that's what got us the DSM-5. Like, there was no data. Like with DSM-4, for example, with gender identity disorder.
Wait. How many trans people wrote the DSM-5?
Man, I don't know.
Well, you said the gay people infiltrated the APA, right? So the American Psychological Association. Okay. So the gay people infiltrated the APA, which is your evidence. When I asked for evidence, you said gay people infiltrated the APA. And then I said, well, did a bunch of trans people infiltrate the
But you have to
DSM-5
understand that these
fighters
people
group?
operate within a broader LGBT movement, and that's what I'm talking about.
You do? Okay, so do you think that all gay people are allies of trans people?
I don't know if in the 90s, but there was a manuscript written about how to unify them. But as far as how we know the LGBT now, no, not necessarily. But I think that the idea of it all kind of stems from the same roots, as far as like this sort of gender ideology, homosexuality, as far as how we're going to make the country become accepting of it. I think that it all stems from basically the same place ideologically.
So do you think the gays have infiltrated multiple levels of things to push an agenda?
I don't think it's to push an agenda. I don't think that there's some grand conspiracy. I think that they exist in this country, which isn't a problem. But the problem that can happen is if they then use their identity to propagate non-truths onto the rest of the country.
So do you think that maybe straight and cis people might be using their identities to propagate non-truths in
Like
regards
what?
to trans people?
Like what?
Well, why do you believe that trans issues aren't how they are classified in the DSM-5? If you have no medical knowledge whatsoever, no psychological expertise whatsoever, if you disagree with the consensus of medical and psychological
It's not the
professionals
consensus.
that
It's a
wrote the
false
DSM,
consensus.
it literally is the consensus. It isn't a false consensus. It is the consensus of medical and psychological
They
professionals
actively
across the world, not just the United States and not just the DSM-5, across the world. It is the medical consensus by all of them that transitioning is the best treatment for people with dysphoria.
they actively suppress any dissenting opinion.
Who's they?
These institutions. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
The
APA, they fight.
DSM does not. Who's being silenced?
There was a guy in
Name
Canada, I believe
five.
he had a
Like literally
gender-
name 5 people that are being silenced.
He had a gender clinic in Toronto, and he was fired because he came out and said that the transition therapy that they were recommending wasn't good and it wasn't the best, and so he was fired because that was the incorrect opinion. They thought that was intolerant or bigoted. I mean,
Okay,
even if
so
you watch,
one guy was fired for something I have not read on, which I'm assuming is probably more fucked up than you just mentioned.
okay, so there was another. I mean, if you look at the history of like John Hopkins University, for example, there was drama there with the guy who used to head their gender clinic. If you look at the depositions that these people are giving in Supreme Court hearings, for example, they're always very hostile towards any differing opinion because it's perceived as bigotry. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong to perceive any dissent as bigotry, but you sort of have to understand
It's not
that people,
any dissent.
what was that?
It's not any dissent that is bigotry. It's perfectly normal to go like, hey, do you think it's in someone's best interest to do X? And if someone says, yes, all of us agree, then yeah, you go with the medical consensus. This is the same way we do anything. This is the same thing we do biology, the same way we do astronomy. This is the same way we do anything that you can't like stick math specifically on. And
So-
even when you do that, they double check and recheck the math. Like people make careers out of double checking math in astrophysics. Like that's all
Yeah.
they do.
So even with the consensus, which I think is actually how we got on this conversation, because I mentioned to you that I believe the institution was the Endocrine Society or whatever. They released something that said that they believe the consensus is that the best treatment for these people, or for transgender people, is to undergo these sort of reassignment therapies and these hormone therapies. But they also admitted within that own statement that this was based on not solid or even very bad evidence, because like I said, there are no longitudinal studies that conclusively, like even the study that I cited as far as the meta-analysis, like that was started in 73 and went to 2003. Like we don't have any updated studies that conclusively say like this is good. Like either they lose track with the participants, they're not SRS generated. It's just not good data. And so I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm just saying that we can't conclusively say. So to come in and say that we
So
definitely
you
have a
agree that
scientific
you sent me
consensus-
bad data to
I'm
try to
saying
make a point that it wasn't making?
No, I'm saying that data was
Okay.
particularly outdated, and it was an analyzing older data.
Okay,
that
which was
also
one of
bad,
the
not data.
first things I said to you. It was outdated, and you still persisted, and we had to talk about it.
Right. So
Okay.
even to come out and say that we can conclusively say that this is, definitely the move, that we have to treat these people in this way, I'm just saying that that's not the move because we don't have conclusive evidence.
So how would you treat a trans person?
I think that are we talking like a trans adult or a trans child? Because for adults, I don't necessarily think that it's our position as a society to tell them what they should and shouldn't do. I guess I like freedom in that sense. But for children, I think that they definitely need therapy in basically all cases.
So they do get therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it would
They
depend
already
on,
do. It's like literally a prerequisite for someone to agree to do puberty blockers, to do hormones, almost always in the United States, at least.
I agree, but I think the intended direction of the therapy should be much different from what it is. So presumably the direction of the therapy that you're referring to, or to which you're referring, is something that is trying to really analyze the direction or the trajectory of this child's gender identity and figure out if they are gender dysphoric or if they're not or whatever. Whereas I'm of the opinion that the therapy should be focused on helping them be comfortable within their own biological sex, because 80 to 95% of them will eventually be comfortable in that and not show signs of gender dysphoria.
I don't think that's what you can do.
Why not?
Because you're going with the majority of people who don't necessarily show any signs of dysphoria, right? And then you're having someone say, hey, I don't feel very comfortable in my body. And while it makes, on the surface, you might say, oh, that makes intuitive sense. You're dealt the hand, you got to play it. You know what I mean?
So it's not just the majority of people, though. Like, it's upwards, or it's up to 95%. Always upwards of 80%. So I think that that's very significant. And I think that because that's the overwhelming majority, that should direct the trajectory of the therapy to which we're giving these people.
Are there any studies that confirm that conversion therapy is a viable substitute for medical transition?
You're not going to find it under the name of conversion therapy, because conversion therapy is best understood within the context of homosexuality and converting someone's sexuality, which is decidedly different from gender identity. So I think that conversion therapy for homosexuals is one thing, and I don't think that that's ethical. However, for gender identity, I think that to call that conversion therapy is an Orwellian abuse of language to suggest that we're trying to convert someone away from their biological sex.
Nope, because it's not about sex.
Okay, so actually,
trans people do not deny their sex.
So we disagree on the divorcing of gender and sex.
Correct.
Okay, so can you describe to me your concept of gender identity and how it pertains?
Yeah, gender identity is how there's a lot of ways that gender identity. So it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with sex. It just happens that because of your sex organs, you tend to present a way we describe as masculine. So, for instance, you and I have male sex organs, so penises, testicles, and we tend to have varying masculine features. I don't know if you can grow a beard, but I have one. I don't know if you just like to shave or if I'm not making a joke. I see stubble. I just don't know if you'd grow it out. So like, for instance, this is seen as masculine. That could technically be whatever, right? So though there is stubble. So a beard is a secondary sex characteristic, something like that.
Why is that perceived as masculine?
Why is a beard perceived as masculine? Because you tend to have facial hair and body hair when you have higher levels of testosterone that typically the sex organs present us. Right. But so that said,
is how gender identity can manifest is all derived from your biology.
Not all derived by biology. Not at all. I gave many examples earlier how it doesn't have anything to do with biology whatsoever. It has to do with societal.
What were those examples?
So things like how I said that Americans don't necessarily see French guys as super masculine, right?
Right, but we still understand that those are men. We can still differentiate
kind
those
of
French women. I don't know that.
Sure, but would you say French women with big armpit hair is typically a feminine trait? You know what I mean?
Yeah, because
or hairy legs.
French women. Yeah, because they're
okay. Women. Just women in general with hairy legs.
I think that you're trying to make.
You know what I'm saying? And so what about a perfectly normal biological woman that is cisgendered and is straight and all the normal things, but also tends to have facial hair, because this happens. A lot of women do have facial hair.
Yeah.
Right. So these are not specific. It just tends to manifest in higher testosterone, but that's not always the case. I mean, it happens sometimes. There just happens to be the case. So while something like a beard, these are secondary sex characteristics. I hadn't even gotten past that, right? So primary and secondary sex characteristics. This is the first thing we see, is like a broader like features, like a jawline. We might have wider trunks. We might have more muscular bodies, and might present masculine. But all of these things can manifest in a perfectly normal cis woman. Right, all of these things, literally all of them.
To a lesser degree, though.
Sometimes absolutely.
No, in all times to a lesser degree, and also
not in all times. You are absolutely, and this again, like you are absolutely more effeminate than some of the more masculine cis women on the planet. Like, you just are.
Yeah, no. What I'm saying is you can find overlap, obviously, but the tendencies aren't just proved.
Right. So I'm just saying it happens, okay? So there's a societal expectation that when we see a big, strong woman, well, that's just kind of weird, isn't it? A big, strong woman it's like a bodybuilder, and we kind of look and we go, I don't know if that's what I'm into, because as straight guys, I assume you're straight, because it's a sin or something, and you see a big, muscular lady, you're like, well, I like feminine ladies, so I don't know if I'm necessarily into that because I like femininity, right? But
you're reciting biological traits. So
right now,
just to
right
be clear,
now.
so a woman who's a bodybuilder, she's obviously
because you didn't seem very clear with that. So okay, so those are some biological traits. So something like a man. So I am expected societally to make more money than my significant other who is a woman. That is something that I am expected to do. That has no biological bearing whatsoever.
It actually does.
I mean, it doesn't if you go like the hunter-gatherers, but you don't even believe the agricultural revolution happened 10,000 years ago, did you?
I do believe in evolutionary psychology. I actually cite it frequently.
Not evolutionary psychology, literally evolution and the agricultural revolution.
Right. So if you believe in evolution, I can assume that you believe in evolutionary psychology, or at least affirm the data. And if you look, I mean,
it depends on what you mean by evolutionary psychology. Do you mean it the way Jordan Peterson means it, or do you mean it in the way it actually exists? Or
well, I mean,
because I don't know I don't even know how it manifests in your head. Because when I say 10,000 years ago, do you believe that existed?
I was gonna just explain myself.
No, I need to know though.
Okay, so I'll explain myself. So what I'm saying is, if you believe not necessarily, that's fine. So if you reject the David Buss research, for example, I believe he was the pioneer of the field. We know that cross-culturally, because he does all of his research on like 32 different cultures across the world, cross-culturally, women find in men the most attractive trait to be potential for resources, and the same goes with men. No, it is. It's not even it can be. They find this cross-culture, like this holds. This is our species. Women like men who have resource potential or actuality. Men like women who have fertility potential or actuality. This is just a fact. That's how it works in the evolutionary psychosphere.
It can absolutely, of course, manifest that way. Absolutely.
No, it's not that it can. It's that the overwhelming tendency is that it does.
Okay, so it's a tendency. It's a tendency, even if it's overwhelming. Even if it's an overwhelming tendency, it can.
So you're trying to cite you're trying to cite exemptions and prove that the rules don't really exist as like concrete rules, because
the rules are slowly not existing anymore. Yes, what we are telling you, as people who are having this discussion, we are saying, hey, these things are less and less common. And as time moves on, as what I said at the beginning of this, these will become less useful in ways that we describe one another. Like I said before, we might not be as useful to say someone is a man as it is as useful to say someone was masculine. As time moves on, the differences in our society comes up between what it was in the year 2000 versus what it is in 2050, something like that. There are differences. So something that is also the case in what we expect out of a man is some form of like kind of aggression, but not in a not in this like pee on me way, but there should be some sort of like bravado, like a social performance that goes into it, right? And not from and I don't mean like a big burly man from a biological standpoint. I mean specifically from the standpoint of, oh, look at that guy, that guy's not a leader, he's a follower. And then we tend to go towards the
why do you think
type A personalities.
Why do you think that society perceives men to manifest aggression in that way?
Why do I think?
Yeah, because basically, and I'll just tell you my opinion on it, and you can dissect it if you would like to. I think that social constructs are basically, to say that a social construct doesn't originate in biology, I think is kind of silly. I think that the social constructs originate in biology, and I think that they exist because biology.
Okay, but you don't even believe in the reality of the other parts of biology that are necessary for you to even assert that claim with like any sort of sincerity. Like that we evolved from a common ancestor.
So did you want to address that point, or are we going to get back into the religion thing?
Well, that's what the basis of it is, right? Because so this happens a lot with conservatives, right? You'll cite biology and you'll say, you can't do that, it's biology. Also, I don't believe in biology. Like,
I never said I don't believe in biology.
You said you don't believe in evolution. Do you believe in evolution?
I believe in the data that we can measure. So for example, this is sometimes gets me in, this sometimes gets me in trouble with my
okay, wait, an easier question besides just the broad evolution. Do you believe that we human beings share a common ancestor that would not be recognized as a human being?
Probably. I don't know. Like, I haven't looked into that particular. I wasn't even taught like evolution in schools. Like, we were basically taught both. My point is that I don't reject the data that you would probably assume that most conservatives would tend to reject. My opinion on God and existence is that if we can measure, like, for example, carbon dating, I don't reject carbon dating. My view on it is basically, if it exists in our world, it's a product of God. And so that we can measure it statistically. Like, for example, conservatives get mad at me when I cite epsych because they say that evolution is contradictory to God. My view of it is that anything that we can measure and that we can learn is basically a result of that existence in the first place, which is why I can, in fact, be consistent and cite things like biology when I'm making arguments, because in my view, that exists as a result of like the divine creator.
Kind of.
Not kind of. That's what's going on.
Yeah, but not really, because you don't really buy into it, right? You go like, maybe I do, maybe I don't. Who knows in this wacky world?
Was that what I did?
You know what I mean? You
I
literally
don't.
did when I asked you, okay, what do you believe? Do you believe we have a common ancestor? You go, I don't know. I didn't learn about that in school. Like, what do you mean you don't
That's
know?
one example. Like, if you want to have a talk about evolution, like, I don't know. I wasn't there. I haven't read about evolution. I
Oh
haven't
God. You don't have to. Okay. All right. So you'd have to rely on scientific consensus, which is a thing you refuse to do with trans people, which is, I think, maybe that you might be a little cognizant of that.
Science, I have to accept every aspect of science as far as the consensus goes.
I think that if you were a reasonable person, you would agree with the consensus of experts in their field of expertise. Yes, you would not go to a scientist to ask about tax law. You would go to a scientist based on whatever science they are a part of. So you would go to Neil deGrasse Tyson. You could be very reliably informed by him on astrophysics, right? And then if you're like a little skeptical of Neil deGrasse Tyson, you could go to the other astrophysicists and see if they agree, and then you could get a consensus informed thing.
Right.
That's not an appeal.
You refuse to acknowledge the problem of that, which is that there are other scientists within that field who we don't hear from because they were booted out of those institutions.
But you can't even tell me who they are or give me proof that this happens. The only people that happens to are people that are abject lying. Like they are part of a system in which they lie about, like, for instance, in regards to astrophysics or evolution or whatever, you have people that are like, no, the earth is only 6,000 years old, and a bunch of scientists go, that's not at all what the data says, and then someone goes, I'm being censored, and they're like, I mean, you're literally going against the science. You're a scientist. It's your job to analyze the data and come to an independent conclusion. If the independent conclusion leads you to the idea that there is a 6,000-year-old Earth, present it, and we will go through it. And it's always debunked because the Earth is older than 6,000 years old. This is the same thing. So when you see someone have a consensus in a field in which they are an expert, and you have skepticism, you can go to the next guy and the next one and the next one. The only reason you would ever go with someone that is the 1% of the 99 of the 100% that dissents is because you want to believe the thing the dissenter believes. That's the only reliable reason to do that, because you have no expertise in any of the fields that we're talking about, yet you agree with only the dissenters, which are a vast minority of the experts in their specific fields. And it doesn't make any sense. You cannot say reliably that you know enough to understand the nuances necessary to agree with the dissent of someone in their specific field.
Do you disagree that we can analyze the data for ourselves, or do you think that we should always outsource that to the scientists?
There's a reason that we have scientific consensus, right? So you are a layman. I am a layman, right? And so when we look at the data and we look at what it says, we have to read what they interpret it as. You absolutely ignored everything in both of those studies that you sent to me, especially the Williams one on suicide. You didn't read the words around the graphs that you were looking at. And you just said, well, that agrees with what I think, right? You think, oh, that shows that those people believe that they have a higher % rate of suicide. So I'm going to say the thing out loud without even thinking about it. But really what you should have done is read the rest of it. And it said literally underneath both of those statistics that, by the way, these statistics are not timelined, and they could be throughout the lifetime of a trans person and are not indicative of whether or not they have gone through transition, sought it, or whatever. Like, this is the type of thing I'm talking about where, yeah, some people can reliably look at data. Those people usually look at data as a profession. The rest of us have to ask for the interpretation of these things because none of us individually have time to be experts in all these fields. Yet you and people like you, often conservatives, almost always, and then there's some people on the left like anti-vaxxers and shit like that are often like, hey, I believe better than doctors. It's like, no, you don't, Tammy. Vaccinate your fucking kid. That's the scientific consensus. And it seems very obvious to me that you don't know what you're talking about when you read these studies, because they're not when you say the words, it's not what's being shown. It's just what you look at when you see a big number next to the word suicide.
Can you send me a study that provides conclusive evidence that transition therapy is the best move?
Can you send me a study that says that it's not?
Well, I mean, I've tried, but I'd like to see.
You didn't, though. What you did
was my claim has been that there is no data. You claim that there's data, so I'd like to see it.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I'll get it to you after this, for sure. I will send you a bucket load of it. There's literally so many.
Why don't you have your live chat do it?
I mean, I could do it. I can send you this right now. I can send you a Google Doc. Do we have a chat in here? Sure. Here's a chat. There's a Google Doc, and it has dozens. There's trans everything. It's just so much. We even got Holocaust denial in there. It's just a big ass Google Doc of all sorts of shit. So go for it. You, to your heart's desire. There are dozens of articles in there, dozens of actual studies in there.
The ultimate research document.
Yeah, it's not mine. There's a list on the left. Depends on what you want to talk about in regards to trans people, but you should read that, and you should actually read it, not just look at the little graphs. It will, because the thing about these studies is they often tell you what influences were there. What do they think about the data? What do they think was good about the data? What do they think was bad about the data? What factors could lead one to believe this thing when maybe you shouldn't believe this thing? You have to talk about these things. Like you literally have to. Like once you sent me the Williams thing and I actually looked at it, I forgot it was called the Williams Institute thing, because I just look at it as the yellow paper report, because I look at it so much, the yellow suicide report, and I have to look at it again. Like I don't know, that's probably the third dozenth time. I don't know how to say that. What, 36th? Like just so many. So like, I mean, it seems to me that you dissent because you want to believe the thing you believe, which is fine. A lot of people do that. It seems that you start with conclusion and work backwards, which a lot of people do, because you start with the conclusion that because you are conservative and you are a Christian, that transgenderism and being transgender, well, that's not normal. So
no, not exactly. Actually, we never really started with the basis of it. So if you'd like to go back to that, we could establish a better consensus.
Sure, but I mean, like right now, you're going to say that you had street cred as an atheist when you were 10 years old or some shit. Like,
no, I was actually going to try and get back to the differentiation between sex and gender identity.
We could talk about that.
Right. So what we kind of got into, but then we kind of got lost with talking about how masculinity manifests in different things. My view of it is basically that when you are assigned your chromosomes, depending on which sperm won the race, whether you have the XY or the XX chromosome, the trait on that, because we didn't actually know about this until I think 1959. In 1921, we figured out that chromosomes determine sex, but it wasn't until 59 that we figured out it was the presence of the Y or the absence of that Y that actually determined if the kid was going to evolve into a boy or if he was just going to evolve into a woman and have the ovaries. And so when that happens, there's a 6-week period in gestation where the baby basically is androgynous and doesn't exercise its particular characteristic. But week 7 is when it's going to decide. The gene is, I believe it's called SRY, which is the sexual region on the Y chromosome that defines whether or not the kid is actually going to develop testicles or ovaries. And then from there, after week 7, those will start to develop and it'll start to secrete the necessary sex hormone that we see in mammals, whether it's testosterone or estrogen. And so with the things you described, for example, like jaw lines and facial structure, greater muscle mass, bone density, all these different things, those all originate with that sort of, I guess, outcome from the
right. And based on those biological factors, you have societal expectations.
I think that the biological factors influence the societal expectations because we can inductively reason how men typically behave and how women typically behave, and we can even see this manifest.
And like I said, until, as we're saying, until those no longer become reliable. And what I'm telling you is those are no longer going to be reliable as we move into the future, as people start to buck against the expectations that they are given based on literally just society. And the idea
that's interesting. I respect that argument, because a lot of people make the argument that they just simply don't exist. So I kind of like the angle at which you're coming from. Like, they do exist, however,
they exist in that we exist, right? But they don't exist without us, right? Gender in society doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like, you can't go to Jupiter and see like gender. Right? Gender isn't a thing out there. Gender isn't even necessarily a thing in any animal that doesn't have socializing, right? So, I mean, like, it just depends. So when people say gender doesn't exist, they mean it doesn't exist in any concrete way. It exists societally, the same way that kind of like, even though we can put a biological factor on like love and stuff like that, the way it manifests and the things we do within the framework of love don't exist outside of like humans. You know what I mean? Like, you could say your dog loves you, but does he experience the same love that I experience when I see him? Probably not. It's probably more nuanced the way I feel. You know what I mean? Because of the way that we socialize. So when someone says gender doesn't exist, it just means apart from humanity's social structures, which is true, because there are many societies that don't view gender the same way that other societies do. And this is just, I mean, it's pretty undeniable. And I don't know how you would really
I'm interested because we can see that some of these traits hold up not only in different species, but also in the very early stages.
Some of them, yeah.
Like, for example,
chimpanzees, dogs, some other social species. Yeah.
I believe the species is vervet monkeys. Like, if they're given different toys to play with, the males will always choose like the balls and the trucks, whereas the females will always choose like the dolls, for example. Like, the tendency is to do that. And then also we know that with
I don't know how reliable that is, but sure.
Well, I mean, the basic idea is that we can see these sort of like masculine and feminine characteristics manifesting in different species, different mammal. And also, like, I think that analyzing children for the purposes of identifying sex differences, whether they're like nature or nurture, is pretty interesting, because we would assume that the nurture at that point would be pretty minimal. And what we find out is that even on like the first day of their birth, little girls spend more time looking at faces and things like that, whereas little boys spend more time looking at mechanical objects and analyzing them. So I think that there is a lot of intuitive nature to the differences between men and women. I don't know that I'm ready to say that these are all societally constructed, but on that hand, I understand kind of where you're going. We're like, okay, if the society is changing, then we might have to sort of get rid of these things. Not necessarily get rid of them, but sort of to a lesser degree emphasize their importance and not really think that they're as important. But I also I'm kind of curious, like, how much do we really emphasize them in the first place? Like, what if these are just occurring?
We emphasize them. No, we emphasize them constantly.
How? Like, what I'm saying is
mostly in language and the way we socialize with one another, right? Like, he did this, she did that, and so if you apply he, you expect a certain thing. If you apply she, you expect a certain thing. These things just literally happen all the time. Also, similar studies show that kids who end up identifying as an opposite gender to the one that they were expected to have at birth typically have the traits that you discussed in regards to how you would expect a cisgender child to have. So
you're right. The interesting thing about those studies, I think that they fail to take into account the reality of neuroplasticity.
So do you fail to? So do you not fail? So are you not skeptical about the monkey study then, when you cite it for the same reason, or what?
Do you think that the neuroplasticity affects monkeys?
Sure.
So are you familiar? I don't mean to condescend, but do you know what I'm getting at? Or I'll explain it for the live chat. So basically the idea is that the human brain will adapt with the way that you are behaving. So in monkeys, I guess that could work if you were constantly giving them certain toys to play with. They might, decide that they want to display those characteristics of interest. But if we look at like the brain scans, they've done like MRIs.
It's like literally a mirroring practice that monkeys do. Some breeds of monkeys. So yeah.
You said doo-doo. I think that when we look at like the brain imaging of kids with gender dysphoria, even adults with gender dysphoria, what we typically find is that they tend to have brain scans that are more similar to the gender with which they identify rather than the gender that they're like biologically assigned at birth, I think is the language. The problem with that, I think, is that if someone behaves or lives their life as if they're...
Did you say gender that they're biologically assigned? Did I hear that?
I still believe that those are synonymous. So that was my bad.
Well,
the sex that they are assigned.
No, so some people say like sex assigned at birth, which is fine, but it's gender assigned at birth because your sex is typically what it is.
Okay, so the gender assigned at birth. So what we find is that those people tend to have brain patterns that are more similar to their gender identity rather than their biological sex. And so what I think that fails to take into account is that if someone is transgender and they're living their life in that way, they're living their life as a woman despite being a biological man, what's going to start to happen is their brain will literally start to adapt and show brain patterns more similar.
We're talking about this in children though, not in adult people living as whatever.
I thought you brought up something about children's brain studies.
Yes, you're talking about a transgender woman living as a woman would tend to obviously have brainwaves similar to a woman, right?
Yeah, and so I think that's conclusions that you could draw. You could draw the conclusion that, of course, this is happening because there's a biological influence on transgender people, and this is like why she has that brain. It's kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, the idea that there can be like a woman's body trapped or a woman's brain trapped in a male body. That's kind of the idea.
Well, this is different because now you're prescribing socialization to the situation in an adult trans person, not a child trans person.
We can say either.
Well, no, you can't because the child hasn't been living as anything yet. They're just a child, right? So like, there's not a lot of socialization that goes on. Like if you grow a child in a situation where gender is not a thing that is pushed onto them, they will typically go with what they feel most comfortable as.
Okay, so you're saying that the brain image of those children who haven't been socialized yet still tends to correspond with their gender identity rather than their biological sex.
It tends to, yes.
Okay,
but that's not always the case. But puberty has a big effect on that, so it depends.
Yeah, puberty tends to make children identify with their biological sex.
Sometimes. Sometimes
times.
it makes them experience incredible dysphoria.
Right, and so that's sort of the intention behind blocking it or postponing it.
Well, there's a lot of people that never got it blocked and still said, like, yeah, that was the worst part of my life when I was having these incredible dysphoric. Like it's not like every trans person started transition when is most medically viable, which is from the point they can identify gender in themselves, to be the least dysphoric road to travel, so to speak. Most trans people never get the opportunity to do that, whether it's they didn't identify it, they just didn't know, they were just unhappy, and they didn't have the language to identify, or the society to identify that maybe I'm trans, whatever. Like one of my good friends is like that. She never understood what she was. She actually explained it once. I don't want to be trans. I just want to be a woman. It was a thought she had, a literal thought she had before she even understood that she was trans, and she still said those things, right? So like it could be very confusing, even for someone that is having this conversation. And she has been having this conversation for some time, right? So even for people in the sphere, it could be incredibly confusing. They might not know. So to have the wherewithal early on as parents to see this in your child and be like, well, maybe we should take steps and just slow it down. And if anything changes, we can adapt to the situation. That's usually the route people go to make sure that someone has the most comfortable upbringing they can have. And we could say something like, these pussy ass kids, I had to go through puberty. But I mean, like, for someone with dysphoria, it's not just going through puberty. It's not just being awkward and having pimples and being scared to grow hair on your asshole. It's literally traumatizing. Like, all of these people experience trauma, and it's not because they grew up in a specific situation. There are people from all backgrounds, whether they are abusive or normal or great, maybe better than the average person, and still people across all walks of life at a roughly the same displacement experience dysphoria and experience being trans, or however that manifests insofar as the gender. But like, so I mean, it really doesn't have any bearing, I guess, what you're saying.
What doesn't have bearing?
So like, I guess the entire sort of thesis of like this isn't the natural course of their being, right? Like, it tends to be the case. We see that, yes, this is naturally how they progress. And we are not saying, not a lot of people are saying that because, of course, you are born with a particular set of sex organs, secondary and primary sex characteristics, you are born with that. And even in a society where transness was in 100% accepted and it was just super normalized, there would still be a population that are unhappy with the physical manifestation of their bodies and how it reflects on their self on the inside. So, I mean, part of it is absolutely socialization. That's a big part of it, because we can help people. Like, any effect of normalizing someone for something they can't control is a good step in the direction. And even better step is to make no stigma on it whatsoever.
So do you see a problem at all, or I guess not necessarily a problem, are you concerned at all with the possibility that since these people have sort of aged into the level where now they can help the younger generations who perhaps are going to be put in similar situations, where now that this is such a normalized discussion, do you think that typical behavior exhibited by children could be misinterpreted as symptoms of gender dysphoria, and then they get put on that track?
Yeah, I think people will overcorrect for a short time, and then it will become something that, I mean, just like anything, like if there's a major societal change in political zeitgeist or just anything, literally anything, we have a tendency to overcorrect for a second. But most of the time it's going to be with good intentions. And most of the time these children, I mean, they're not even children, pretty much nobody goes hurt, right? Like, there are some people that might resent their parents or whatever. And there's some people that absolutely will force their kids, like cis people, force their kids to be cis. I'm sure there will be cases where people are like, you're a girl. And they're like, no, I'm a boy. I have a pee-pee. Like, I'm sure that'll happen at times. But we have to understand that just because their trans people exist, and some of them might make mistakes, like Jessica Yaniv is a perfect example of this. Are you familiar with the Jessica Yaniv story? Okay, chat, go look it up if you don't get it. Jessica Yaniv, let's just say bad person, also trans, right? There's a stigma involved with this, and this is part of normalization, that because Jessica Yaniv is bad, you can go, see? Trans people doing bad stuff. Jessica Yaniv does not reflect on the trans community. The only people that make Jessica Yaniv reflect on the trans community are people that are transphobic, typically, or people that have some sort of political agenda, right? in the same way that I have no bearing on your moral character, right? If I go kill somebody, like it's not because Michiganders are bad guys, right? It just happens that we both have similar demographic standpoints, and bad things happened. We don't represent one another. The idea is that we normalize it.
So I guess actually, while on the subject of children, we should probably clarify. Do you think? I guess I should ask. What do you think is the cause of gender dysphoria? Not necessarily the dysphoria aspect, but what do you think is the cause of an individual feeling?
The incongruency between how someone feels about themselves and
right. So what do you think causes that incongruency? Is what I'm asking.
I have no idea. I don't know that trans people necessarily know the answer to that question, but you could ask them.
Do you think it's a biological thing, or do you think it's an environmental thing?
I think it's often biological and environmental. I think it's both, because consider the environment of someone that is biologically trans, right? Same way that someone is biologically.
What is biologically trans?
I have no idea. I don't know that this is actually. I don't know that we can't. Do we know what the gay gene is? Right? No, not necessarily. But we do know how.
Okay. You mean like they're genetically predisposed to it? Okay.
I don't mean that. I'm meaning that I don't know that the science is in on this, but I do know that brain scans are coming through that show that people experience this type of thing very early on in life, including gender dysphoria. And it's the same. It's like, is there a PTSD gene? Not necessarily. Right. Is there a depression gene? Like we don't go like, there is the herd of depressions. Usually because they're inside, but also because like, there's not like a spot you can pick. I'm sure there are predispositions in regards to our genetic code that would lead someone to display a certain thing we consider X, Y, or Z, whatever. Yeah. But environmentally speaking, if you feel like you are genuinely X and someone says, no, you are Y, there will obviously be a dysphoric reaction to that.
So do you think then the solution to that dysphoric reaction would be to adjust their body to their identity rather than to adjust their identity to their body?
It's usually yes, typically, yes. I'm absolutely sure that for a minority of people, the opposite case might help. I'm sure, because everyone is different. But it seems that the overwhelming majority of people ought to seek transition in the way that is typically seen. Now, 20 years down the road, as we have this discussion and we normalize transness, instead of trying to push them to the sidelines and say, no, you're not valid, you are a man because you have pee-pee, we should say, hey, whatever you want to do with your body is what you should do. Okay, we should avoid situations where children are experiencing dysphoria, and we should make sure that we have as best science as possible to back this up. And if we find out in 10 years that having kids at 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old transition socially and then transition near puberty by taking puberty blockers, if we find out that that's wrong, then the community will adjust and they will say, okay, well, we won't do that anymore. Here's what we'll do instead. Maybe there's a better way to do it with science as it progresses in medicine. But right now, this is the best thing. We can't go, what will happen when we can have fucking like, when we can just grow new organs and we can like sprinkle some vagina stem cells on my dick, and then overnight I'm going to have a really rad vagina. Like, that would be great. I'm sure a lot of trans people would really love dick to vagina fairy powder, but it's not a thing we have, right? And if it was entirely reversible. So, I mean, these are just the things that happen. Like the first cases of people that transition, medically speaking, when they had bottom surgery, didn't go well. A lot of people died. Have you seen The Danish Girl? It's a great movie. You should watch it. Might help. And like, these surgeries were dangerous, and no one is denying the fact that they are dangerous, but in the pursuit of happiness and trying to make sure that you have the best possible life to live, fuck it, go do what you have to do. Like, absolutely go do it. And I understand that you're like, no, but the kids, right? But no,
I think this is actually more indicative of a differentiation between your and my views of how people should go about their lives. As far as the pursuit of happiness, you sort of alluded to this idea that people should just basically do whatever they want, in the sense that like what they believe will make them feel good is what they should do. And I kind of wanted to see if that logic applies with other things. For example, another type of dysphoria that we see a lot, dysphoria, for example, I believe it's called bodily immuno something. It's BIID, and that is what people
talking about. Body dysmorphia, or
no, body dysmorphia, isn't that when people just believe that they're not attractive?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, not that. Well, that is actually a good example. Or even with anorexia, or with it's BIID. I don't know what it stands for, but it's basically when people self-identify as someone who is disabled, and they believe and oftentimes seek surgery to actually amputate limbs or sever their spinal cord. And so what I'm asking is basically if you
Yeah, but do we agree that the best thing to do for someone is to paralyze them? Like, I don't think any medical consensus necessarily.
Right, but the principle that you said is like a precedent was that people should basically do whatever they want, in the sense that, if it makes you happy, go ahead and do it.
I have no problem with someone electing to do something to their body necessarily. What I do want is to make sure that the medical professionals that sign off on such a thing do so with care and prudence and with compassion, and make sure they do the right thing. So if someone just says, if a doctor and a psychologist say, I mean, this person's clearly not disabled, but they want to be, do I have a problem if one of my friends wanted to do that? I would probably try to talk them out of it. But at the same time, is it ethical for me to say, no, you are not allowed to do that?
So you don't think that in itself, like performing that, would be fundamentally unethical?
I mean, do you think, like, do you recall Terry Schiavo? It's a little bit different. Terry Schiavo was a Florida woman who was brain dead, and there was a big hoo-ha about it between basically fundamental Christians, and it's just some more conservative people that might not necessarily be Christian, and then the other people on whether or not to take her off life support. This is a very similar situation, right? Except in this case, we're doing it to someone who can't.
Is that a similar situation? Yeah, I think that's
who necessarily can't feel the difference, right? But I guess it just depends on your
She wasn't sentient, was she?
I don't know at what stage of her disability she was at. I'm pretty sure she was considered brain dead. So yeah, so I have no problem with it.
Consent to it. Okay.
So she couldn't consent. This is what I'm saying. So it's a little bit different, but at the same time, I don't find it unethical to end the pumping of a heart of something that isn't experiencing life.
So is your framework of morality basically?
Well, no. Do you find that unethical though, to take her off life support?
Yeah, I do.
This is interesting because I think it's the same side of the or different side of the same coin necessarily, right?
Is your framework of morality like basically, I don't want to speak for you, but like more of a consent-based morality?
Yeah, it would be if the person was capable of consent, right?
Okay.
So I don't think that someone who is brain dead, and there was, again, she had no chance of not becoming brain dead, right? She had no brain activity whatsoever. So yeah, I think that consent is incredibly important in regards to what is ethical.
So do you think that someone who is experiencing dysphoria and feeling those symptoms, whether it's anorexia or the disabled disorder that we talked, do you think that they're in a position to like consent to those type of surgeries that will?
It depends. That's why I said that they should make sure that medical professionals do it with the understanding that is the case, right? That was my caveat to that entire situation, where if medical professionals, in the case of trans people, they already have to get therapy, and they have to have two different medical professionals sign off on the situation. And this is before surgery. I don't even know what the requirements are for surgery necessarily, but this is just for hormones. So, I mean, in regards to that, I think that's entirely prudent. I think that makes a lot of sense. It takes the liability off the doctors. It makes sure that a person has been talking about it with a professional that deals with mental health. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. I think that most people need therapy to some degree. I think it's incredibly good, and I think we should have expanded access to it for literally everybody. But that's a whole other discussion. But I think it's absolutely prudent to make sure that someone is mentally aware of the thing that they're asking for. And if you decide that they are mentally aware, and if you decide that it is in their best mental health interest, and you have medical professionals that want to do that, then go for it. But a lot of these times it's people that like blind themselves with bleach in the kitchen. It's people like there's a person that lives in my hometown that had postpartum depression and cut off her hands because she was worried she was going to strangle her kids, right? This person needed like therapy, right? This wasn't a thing where the feeling of cutting off her hands was valid necessarily. It was a situation where she was going through incredible trauma and psychological torment. So most of these situations that you're talking about that aren't transness whatsoever, that are not nearly as well documented as transness, nor are they as prevalent, nor are they as similar.
I think that the principle is similar. I think that my view on reality and how we interpret it, I think probably diverges from your view. My view is basically that we should use reality to sort of aid in our pursuit of flourishing rather than trying to fight against it. So basically, we should subscribe to an objective form of reality and incorporate that, how it will help us flourish, rather than what it seems like you believe. And
there is an objective reality.
There is not objective. That's your.
I agree that there is objective reality. I think we disagree on what it is.
Okay. So with your interpretation of that, it seems like it's basically that as long as people have a general idea of what they want, and as long as the people who are going to facilitate that for them have a general idea that they are indeed competent in expressing that they know what they want, then it should just be okay and permissible.
I can't think of an ethical argument against it if everyone is consenting and experts in whatever relevant field are taking part in it and signing off on the practice. So if someone wants to tattoo their entire body to look like a lizard and stuff like that, I mean, I have no problem with that. Like,
people
that's
with full body tattoos with like lizards on it, for example, that they display much different symptoms in the long run than people with like gender dysphoria or transgenderism.
Sometimes, but sometimes it can be dysphoria that leads to people doing such
I guess
things.
my
Maybe not
question
just gender dysphoria, right?
basically rests on: do you see any ethical conflict with asking a child who we would not recognize as someone who could consent to these type of procedures?
They're not consenting to any procedures. What do you mean? They're not consenting.
I'm talking about when we go
bottom
through
surgery and stuff.
No, not necessarily that, but when we go through like the puberty blockers and the hormone therapy, like that's still something that's going to have like
puberty blockers are given to non-trans kids all the time without their informed consent.
Right. But for different causes, like they have what is the precocious puberty, and so those are necessary to make sure that the secretion doesn't happen.
Sometimes,
right. So that's kind of I guess that actually makes sense in the sense that it kind of follows parallel to where we disagree. So like someone who is transgender who wants access to those hormones are basically
but dysphoria is also a disorder that is recognized by medical professionals, and a treatment is on the table for puberty blockers. Again, not all children who are trans and experience dysphoria get puberty blockers.
So there have been
like what?
There have been cases where the people will go to like the hospital, for example, and or not the hospital, it's the doctor, the general doctor, and they will want access to these hormones. And there have been doctors who don't necessarily subscribe to this therapy, and they've denied them. And I believe lawsuits have been filed on the basis of discrimination by basically saying, you know, if you will give these hormones out for a treatment for this disease, why wouldn't you do it for this condition? Or something like that. So I think that
because it goes against medical consensus,
So I think that you're basically operating from the framework that
it'd be the same thing as someone saying like a vet saying, no, I'm not going to give your dog heartworm medication. I'm going to give him a diluted sample of vinegar because I'm a holistic veterinarian now. Like, that person would lose their veterinarian license, right? This is the thing that happens.
So the same treatment for different causes, and you and I.
So it's a different treatment.
The same treatment would be for different causes. Like the same treatment would be, okay, we're giving you testosterone. Maybe it's because you have precocious puberty. Maybe it's because you want to transition. You want to start taking these hormones. I have yet to see a study that concludes decisively that this is the. I know what you're talking about as far as the experts have consensus, but I've also seen like within those statements, I believe I'm going to say it again from the Endocrine Society, but I could be wrong there, that they even acknowledge that the data from that was like bad and inconclusive data. So I just don't think that we can be conclusive that these are unfailingly the best moves.
Well, I sent you a bunch of links that disagree with that.
I did see the
there's
the
lots of them. There's so many studies that disagree with the things you said.
I would be curious to see the methodology of those studies, because I have a feeling that might be some of the bad data which they were describing.
Oh, do you see what you did?
What?
You started with the conclusion before you read the thing. You did the thing I said you did that you said you didn't do.
I said I'd be interested to see, implying that like I will go see.
Right, because my expectation would be that they have bad data. Yeah.
Right, because I've read something.
You already know what you want it to say.
No, I've read this piece of information that says that these studies have bad data. You say that these studies don't have bad data, so I have that in my mind, and I think, well, I'll read them, but they could in fact have bad data.
It doesn't sound like the best faith.
I'm not sitting and saying I refuse to read these studies, because
of course you're not saying you refuse to read the studies. It's that the way in which I don't know. It's very much the way a creationist would be like, hey, I'm sure I'll read your study about radiometric dating, but really, if it goes over 6,000, I'm not buying it. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I already told you that I don't reject that research.
I'm not saying you specifically, but
okay. I kind of wanted to get back to what we think causes gender dysphoria. I've seen twin studies. Dysphoria? I think that there is a biological predisposition. For example, we see a characteristic in young boys and young girls. It's referred to as their activity level. Basically, young men have a higher activity level. We like to be rough and tumbling, and girls don't necessarily. And so what tends to happen with young males who are gender dysphoric is they have a lower activity level, and they start to associate, excuse me, they start to associate their behavior not necessarily with that of their peers or their male peers, but with their female peers. And so that can be part of what causes it. But there was a twin study, I believe it's the largest one that was ever conducted in 2011 or 2013, that basically concluded that in cases where one twin was transgender, the other twin was only transgender 20% of the time. And so that suggests like a biological predisposition of roughly like 20%, but that doesn't account for all of it. And if we could expect that there would be prenatal factors and genetic components to it, we would expect it to be like a 99 or even 100% pairing, I guess you would say, of them both identifying as transgender, not identifying as transgender, but that's just not what we're seeing. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, twins aren't clones is mostly the answer to that.
Right, but the idea would be if there were a biological factor influencing gender dysphoria, it would be either genetic or it would be in the prenatal hormones, and they're exposed to the same the same prenatal hormones that have.
Okay, so let's say this is true. Let's just say it is true, right? As far as that, and that twin studies are reliable. They're not really reliable in this instance, but
why not?
20% is so much higher than the general population. How do you explain that?
The 20% of the time they identified as well, they're twins, and so they were probably raised in the same environment. So,
okay, so you're saying it's all environmental?
I'm saying that we know that it's not 100% biological, which is what we would expect it to be if it were prenatal, if it were genetic. So the fact that there are 20% does actually, in a way, make a case for it being environmentally based, because they were in the same environment growing up, in theory. And so we could expect that would probably tend to make it manifest higher than the average population, since they both happen to be concentrated in that environment.
Sure, I get. I don't like relying on twin studies. They're not.
Why not?
Well, because they're not clones. They're two individual people, and you can have different hormonal experiences, or
literally cannot.
Or exposure in. You can have different hormonal exposure between twins. Yes, you can.
That's kind of the novelty of twin studies, like when they're in the womb.
That's not. That isn't science. That just isn't science.
They're not exposed to the same hormones in the womb.
They are exposed to similar hormones in the womb, but not 1-to-1.
Well, obviously,
they aren't clones. They're just literally different people that do not have the same genetic material.
Right, but that would be the closest it could possibly be to having clones in that circumstance if we wanted.
Well, sure, but it isn't reliable in the way that people think twin studies are reliable, right? When people cite twin studies, they often do, and this is kind of what you're doing, where they go, well, these are two people with, and they're two examples of the same person, and they're split in half. And now we can see how one reacts to this stimulus and the other one reacts to this. But we know that for instance, sexuality is largely an inborn trait that you are born with. And we have gay and straight twins. I mean, we have twins that look different. We have like they're just not clones. It's just so like I don't even know where to begin on that, because it's like just so not very sciencey. It's good science if you are only studying social things. Like if you are like, okay, these two people grew up in the same household, and we show them two different things, and we know that they had roughly the same upbringing. But I mean, even in that case, the parents could treat them differently. They could have different friends at school. They could treat each other differently. They could watch different television. They could enjoy different things when they come home. They could like different foods. Like there's so many environmental factors that change between just two people existing, even in the same home. Do you have siblings?
Yeah.
Think about how different that was for the two of you. One of you is the favorite. The other one might be.
It really wasn't that different. I think that you're citing things that are kind of individual quirks about one's environment. But I think that the overall arching environment is basically
Yes, but these all contribute to nature and the environment of someone
think that the
socializing.
food that someone eats influences their predisposition to gender.
Yes, 100%. Food is one of the contributing factors to things based on nutrition. So if someone only eats chicken nuggets and your brother won't ever eat anything else but frozen fucking pancakes, one of you is going to have a higher protein intake, which have a differentiation in regards to brain development. I mean, there's so many things. Hormones. There could be more hormones in the chicken nuggets than there are in the fucking frozen waffles. Like there's so. It's not just food. There's just so much data involved in a human being that you cannot reliably take a twin study and use it as anything other than pretty much what it is it's really cool and interesting pseudoscience. Like they're really not that, unless you're trying to find out like genetic predispositions, if they share genetic markers in their DNA for like diseases that are genetic in nature. Like these are the types of things that you can do. But as far as like social stuff, it's just fun and cute, and it doesn't really have bearing on real life because there are so many environmental factors that contribute to making a human being who they are.
So even if the environmental factors can be eliminated from consideration, that still doesn't really explain why it was only 20% of the time that they identified the same. Like if it were a biological factor.
It's not only 20%. That is a huge number.
Right, but if
it implies much more a biological predisposition than it does a social predisposition.
If there were, okay, so I guess the question would be, what margin of error do you think there is in the
I have no fucking idea.
No, in the differentiation between the exposure that these kids have to like hormones in the womb?
There's literally no way that I could give you a number on what I think the margin of error is.
Just speculate, because what I'm saying is if you think
there's speculate, that's irresponsible.
Well, you can, because if there's
no, we don't. That'd be me doing the thing you do, where I just go, well, I guess I can be an expert.
Do you get what I'm saying, though? Because if it was 20%, that means that what I was saying is 80% of the time it's influenced by the environment. You're saying, no, it's 20%, but that's huge. I'm like, okay, why wasn't it 99% then? If it was biologically
No, I'm not saying it's the environment. I'm saying it tends to imply more likely that there's a biological predisposition rather than any societal disposition because of the 20%, which is much higher than the population at large between siblings. Between anybody.
Right, so if that was biological, then why did the environment reverse it? Like if it was unfailingly biological.
It's not unfailingly biological. It would imply that there is a biological component to it because they share similar genetic markers. So you would see a higher prevalence. But again, because it's not one-to-one, you can't get past the fact that they're twins. They don't have the same genetic material. So what I'm saying is one twin could have different markers in regards to what's going on here, because twins can commit the same to commit crimes, and they'll be pinged for different shit. They don't share. They're not clones. They don't have exactly 100% the same biological material. I don't even know how to explain this if you don't get away from the twins or clones kind of pseudoscience thought process you're having here.
I mean, I was basically operating under the assumption that this is going to be circuitous, but that if they're in the same environment when they're in gestation, and then their genetics are not 100% identical, but they are twins after all, pretty identical. That we would
pretty identical is the differentiation, and this is why you would tend to see a higher predisposition of transness or gayness or whatever. These statistics kind of run the gamut. In twins, you see a higher disposition of homosexuality or bisexuality or whatever in twins, where one of them is one of those things. You tend to see higher. This is the same thing. It's not implying that there is a societal change. It is implying that there is a biological one, because the statistic is so much higher when it is twins. But that said, it's like not super reliable if you want to do a social meta-analysis, because there are so many factors that go into them, and they are not the same person. There's just a statistical likelihood that it is a little bit higher. That is it. That's all you can say. You can't. You literally can't go any more deep into it, because we don't know if there's a gay gene, if there's a trans gene, if there's any of that. We don't know. So it's hard to say with any accuracy other than conjecture and wild speculation, which is incredibly irresponsible, that these twin studies have anything to do besides they're kind of cute and they're pseudoscience. Like, I mean, they're cool to talk about. Like, that's really all it is. And I don't know why we're discussing them.
I'm trying to figure out what role you think the environment plays relative to the biological predisposition.
Of what? Transness?
Yeah.
I'm
like
sure
being gender
some
dysphoria.
amount,
because
but you
what I'm getting at is that if it were,
I can't reliably do that,
if
there's not studies on that.
If it were an innate biological thing, that would be one situation. And okay. I don't know that we should make lifelong or decisions that impact someone's entire life based on something that might not in fact be innate to their biology.
But again, you're not.
I'm not.
No.
What do you
You're
mean?
not. Like okay, so you have a kid and they say, "Hey, I'm a girl," and you're like, "Okay, you're a girl," and we use she/her pronouns. Your name is Ashley. Okay, so Ashley grows up. She takes puberty blockers, and then at a certain point, she goes, "You know what? I am not comfortable as a woman. Maybe I'm a man." Okay, so you're not Ashley anymore. You're Alex. Okay, and we'll stop the puberty blockers. You go through puberty. You grow a beard and everything like that, and you still have your male sex organs. And then later on, you go, you know what? I think I actually am is non-binary. I don't think I really fit into either of one of these. You go, okay, now my name is Ash, and I use they/them pronouns. And then maybe later on, you change again. Who gives a shit? Like, it's not that big a deal.
So
like,
the issue I have is just sort of this discrepancy between these two statistics. The first of one being that when you look at the social implications of going through that transition as a young child, so now you've got the entire community understanding that you're identifying as this gender, you go through all this, everyone's in support of you. I think that poses a pretty strong weight to put on a child's shoulders. With now they sort of have this thing like, we've gone this
but
step.
This is only a feelsy argument, right? There's no data to back this up. You are going
well, there was I know I mentioned the stat earlier. I'm trying to get there. I mentioned the stat earlier that kids that had begun the process and they've gone through the cross-sex hormones and the puberty blockers and all that, like virtually none of them then decide later in life, as you mentioned, that, you know what, I don't want to identify as this. So what I'm saying is that if we know that left to go through puberty in the natural cycle, 80 to 95% of them will grow out of their dysphoria, is it then not dangerous to look at any symptom of gender dysphoria and think that we need to start going through this hormone therapy because this is unfailingly what has to happen in order to make you have a good quality of life? That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Would it be dangerous?
I think it is dangerous. I think
it doesn't seem to be dangerous at all.
I think it is dangerous. And that's kind of why you asked, like, why I care so much about the suicide rate. Because I think that dysphoria and having that sort of symptom, I think that when that manifests,
but it's more than one symptom.
Well, yeah,
dysphoria
obviously
is the major thing that people talk about, but the symptom of dysphoria is many things. It's a cascade of things.
Right,
and
having that.
And so if someone is experiencing that, even if later on they decide that what caused the dysphoria before doesn't cause it now, it was still prudent to treat the dysphoria as it manifested whenever they experienced it.
I think that's assuming that they're always correct about the dysphoria.
So it'd be diagnosed by a medical professional and probably multiple, and
so,
it would be experienced by the person. It's this is very much, again, I like to use the PTSD discussion because it's easy, or depression is even easier. Like I don't know how to tell someone they're not experiencing a thing they say they're experiencing, and then when we do the thing they say, yes, this helps, and then later on they go, well, I don't need that anymore, I'm not experiencing dysphoria. And you're like, but you still are a girl now, even though you said you were a boy. And you're like, yeah, but now I'm okay with it. Like, even if and this is not typical of trans people's experiences, but even if it was typical of trans people's experiences where they only experience dysphoria in those pubescent years, but we know that dysphoria is incredibly taxing. It's traumatic. It is hard, and it leads to people having suicidal thoughts at a much higher rate than we would like as a society. The correct treatment would still be transition. It would still be the same thing because that's what helps them. Even if in the future, and again, this is not the typical experience of a trans person, even if detransitioning was 100% what trans people did, it would not be wrong to initially transition if it cured the dysphoria. This is the disconnect. Like there's some idea here that, like, if you undo it, it was bad. It's like, no, it helped them. Like, you can go off SSRIs if you can manage your depression without them. That's fine.
Yeah, but undergoing the treatment, like even with taking puberty blockers, for example, it still delays the process and stunts you relative to your peers.
Except during that time, that was what they needed to be okay. It's like saying don't take your depression medication because it could make you balloon like a big fatty boombalatti.
You're assuming, and this is the consensus, or so you've told me, that the puberty blockers in that particular instance are unfailingly the correct move. So what I'm saying, like in that Google Doc you sent me, for example.
Okay, but that's not the only situation that this kind of thing occurs. That's why we have to extrapolate it out and talk about other situations in which kids are given medications that have side effects that would be as destructive, in your opinion, as something like a puberty blocker. So, for instance, a kid that has cancer going through fucking chemo, it's going to rip their body to shreds that are not going to develop at a natural age. But that's not to say we should let the leukemia go.
Do you think
because both can kill them?
Do you think that there's a difference between having cancer and believing that you are a gender which you are not?
I believe there is a difference between cancer and experiencing gender dysphoria, but I don't think that we should take one more lightly because the other one is something that we can tangibly see, and the other one is killing people in a way that is just inside them.
Like, your view of gender dysphoria seems to be that, and I think we even clarified this, that we should have the individual conform their body to their perceived reality of gender, whatever that may be for them.
Sometimes that's the case. It's not all the time. Like, again, there's this misconception that every single trans person medically transitions or whatever. Like, sometimes it's literally just a pronoun change and a name change and they're fine. Sometimes it's much more severe than that. Sometimes it's people that need to seek out plastic surgery for the rest of their lives and they're never happy with their form, and it's a combination of dysphoria and dysmorphia. Sometimes there's people that only want bottom surgery. Sometimes there's people that only want to dress different and never get any surgery. Sometimes there's people that don't even want to use hormones. Transition looks different for every single person.
That's kind of what I'm worried about.
So when you frame it, why are you worried about that? Why are you worried about people living their life however they want?
I tried to bring this up a couple minutes ago. The Google Doc, which you sent to me, it had, though, I think one of the guidelines from the APA, their handbook. I believe it is in that document that they reference different symptoms that children might have when they're experiencing early onset. Would you call it early onset, or just gender dysphoria at an early stage in their life? And like one of them was showing expressly an interest in toys that typically are associated with the opposite sex.
I don't think we should gender. The idea of gendered toys is really strange to me. Like, I mean, like, did you ever play with a girl toy once when you were growing up?
I did, but the method for playing with them was much different.
Because I really liked the idea of playing with a Ken doll.
I played with Barbie because I had sisters, so I played with Barbies and Kens, but they always ended up murdering each other and like taking.
Well, that's just sociopathy, I think.
So you can say that. No,
it's violent. That's weird. But
did you play with army guys? Did you simulate the Great Oil Wars with your army guys?
No, I liked like robots and shit.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, still violence. Don't get me wrong. Like, violence did happen, but I had girlfriends that were girls as a child that also exhibited violence within their own like car crashes with Barbie. The Barbies would fight each other. Like
this isn't the pink Corvette.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, it's not like kids don't play that differently.
It's
just that I mean, they can, but they really don't that much. Especially when the parents don't necessarily push a certain idea behind it, because you can say in a study, like, they gave boys, free reign of the playground. They gave girls free reign of the playground, and they did this thing with the toys, right? But you would have to have a control group of parents who didn't raise their kids with any gender involved, with any expectations involved. And I don't know that those studies necessarily exist. Like, do they?
I did see one that I thought was pretty interesting. It had a pretty interesting, not interesting. It had a pretty expansive sample size. I think it was a couple thousand, which I thought was perhaps could control for that to some degree, just expanding the sample size. But basically what it found is that when kids are free to play on playgrounds, like you mentioned, boys will tend to play games, whereas girls just tend to play. And I don't know if this resonates with your experience growing up. For example, girls will play things like hopscotch, or they'll like role play, for example. But boys tend to play games with like a structured set of rules, and there's a winner and there's a loser. And girls can obviously play those too, and boys can like role play and play games too. But what we typically see is that when given free range, they tend to differentiate in the methods and the goals of their little
hopscotch
games.
Seems like a game. I don't know.
Is there a winner?
In hopscotch?
I'm asking. Maybe I was excluded from that.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, you have to place a thing down at the end, and whoever gets furthest wins.
I thought it was like you have 10 tiles or something, and you just go around and around and around.
Yeah, and you have to pick it up and put it down and shit.
Hopscotch. You pick up hopscotch.
There's like a toy, maybe a jack or something. I don't know. I didn't grow up in 1945, so I don't know how hopscotch works. But I do know that there is like
a boomer John Doyle.
I do know that like hopscotch on a playground tends to not have a thing, but like it is like a oh, I did better than you situation, right? Like,
I don't know. Or even like when they're playing like house or whatever, not to be all stereotypical. What I'm saying is that we do observe tendencies in the way that boys and girls like to play. And you make the argument that they're probably socially influenced, which is
I would definitely assume that they were socially influenced, especially depending on when the study was taking place, right? Like if this was in the 80s or something, like I wouldn't expect it differently. But if you have say, we raise our kid as a boy, regardless of what sex organs they have, we raise our kid as a girl, we raise our kid as a gender neutral person, I would expect that you would find very similar data throughout, and the gender neutral kids would have a roughly 50-50 split.
How do you go about raising a child as gender neutral?
I have no idea. I don't have kids, and I don't know that I would want to do that. But
is the idea basically?
Well, the idea, I guess, I don't not have no idea. I just don't know that it would like. I see the idea of having a kid be anything to me seems like pushing it onto them.
Yeah.
So a gender neutrality would basically be like boys aren't blue, girls aren't pink, boys don't play with Army dolls, girls don't play with Barbies. It would be, and I think they probably would have to be in a situation where they're not really consuming a lot of television at this point, because we still gender a lot of our media and stuff like that. But I'm sure you can do it. I'm sure it's possible. And I mean, there's a lot of parents that just don't enforce gender stereotypes, but still gender their kids. Like I went to school for education, and you tend to see if you don't push those stereotypes, that it moves closer to the median, where you see children doing shit on both sides of the spectrum, I guess you would say.
What did you mean with as far as like how they're engaging in activities?
Yeah, engaging in activities. So you would see more girls engage in like playing basketball with the other boys, and you'd see more boys ended up playing hopscotch with the girls and so on. And it just moves around depending on as long as you stop necessarily saying these are boy activities, these are girl activities, they tend to not separate themselves, because when they hear that, girls over here, boys over here, okay, you guys get balls, you guys get doll houses, they're going to naturally be like, I'm a girl, so I'm going to go over there, and now I like this because this is the thing I know I like. You know what I mean? Like it's a child is not as nuanced as saying like why don't I like that activity? Like it's a complicated thing, social interaction, especially when they're having fun doing a thing. Kids are thinking about doing the fun thing, but a lot of people show interest across sexes in other stuff. I mean, there's lots of women that enjoy things that we would consider masculine all the time.
So you don't think then that gendered activities or objects should be used as a symptom for diagnosing gender dysphoria?
In regards to their object,
or at least until we can sort of
no, I don't, because I don't think we have reliable standards for that, because we gender our society so much.
Okay.
And so if you can, then if it comes out that like 33% of people with penises and 33% of people with vaginas tend to stratify off into the binary, and then we have 33% in the middle, or it's even less, whatever, they kind of just wobble in between, it would be pretty expected to see most people tend towards binaries because of the way that we are binary in society, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it would be unlikely to expect differentiation in regards to that if they have a mommy and daddy, and they see daddy watching football and they see mommy cooking, or vice versa. Even if you have a man in the house that tends to do what we consider female activities, which is stupid, but and you see the mom watches a bunch of football, I bet you would see the reverse effect, like tomboys exist, like, you know what I mean? Like, so I just don't know that we can use societal expectations in this regard rightly to determine what to do for dysphoria.
Do you think that the way that those sort of subconsciously influence the behaviors of children, do you think that's harmful? Do you think that it would be better if we move towards a more gender neutral system?
I don't think it's harmful to like a thing and then have your kid also like a thing. I don't even necessarily think it's harmful to go, oh, my kid is a boy when you see a penis, right? I don't think that's necessarily harmful. What I think is harmful is and maybe you've experienced this, but having parents buck against a child that seems interested in not doing a thing that you would expect as a gendered norm. I remember I tell this anecdote all the time. And this is not evidence for anything. This is just an experience of kind of a thing when I like to talk about like things like toxic masculinity and things like that, which does not mean that masculinity is toxic. It just means that there are aspects that we associate with masculinity that can't be toxic. I also believe that about femininity, by the way. So, like beauty standards are a good example. So, I was playing like Nintendo or something. It was like some tennis game, and I picked one of the girl characters because I wanted to play the girl character in the tennis game. And I mean, I'm talking like Nintendo, like
NES or SNES?
NES. And so, like it was my dad's when he was in college or some shit. I don't know, or maybe just after because I was born in '88ish. So yeah. Anyway, so I picked that, and my dad was like, "What are you, a girl? What do you want to pick the girl character?" And like, it's just one of those things where I was like, "Well, I guess not. I'm a boy. I'm not a girl." And then my mom was like, "Why does it matter?" And she's not even like this diehard feminist. She doesn't care about any of the shit I talk about. She is just like she's not a very cerebral person in general. But even she was like, why does that matter? And so I remember that conversation. It's like a flashbulb moment for me because I thought, why does it matter? And I don't know. Like, and I did other stuff after that. I hunted. I liked to play sports. I was a jock all throughout high school. But I was also kind of a nerd. Like I don't know. There's different aspects of masculinity that I definitely align in, and there's others that I don't find incredibly, I don't find them very useful necessarily, and I find some of the aspects toxic. And yeah, so I don't know.
I kind of agree in the sense that I think that people have they lack a nuanced understanding of like what it means to be a man or a woman, in the sense that we tend to have these stereotypes of like how men should behave or how women should behave. And I actually think that's part of the reason that so many children end up developing gender dysphoria, is because they don't really have a nuanced understanding of it in the first place. For example, they might view the way that these people
incels, but
they might view the way that these people behave and attribute that to themselves because maybe they don't belong with the boys because they want to go do what the girls are doing, or vice versa. And actually, you asked how I would treat this, or how I would like to see this be treated. I think that one of the things you can do with children is help them develop a nuanced understanding of like what it actually means to be a boy. Like, hey, you can like to play with girls and like to play hopscotch or whatever, since we're using that as an example, but you can still like be a boy. And there was one example that I read, which I thought was...
Do you think you'd raise your kids like that?
Like what?
Where you'd reinforce the idea that they don't have to fill gender roles?
Give me a gender role.
Okay.
I think we'd have to go case by case.
Okay, so there are some gender roles that you find useful.
Yeah.
Okay, like?
Well, I mean, I don't know what you would define as a gender role. To me, these are just like natural things.
Okay, so a gender role would be something that you would typically expect one of the genders in the binary to do. Like, and that would be what you would like them to do, based solely on the fact that they are gender X or Y.
I don't know if it would be based solely on. Could you give me an example of one that you?
Women having babies.
Oh yeah.
Right. See, I.
But I don't know that that's explicitly them. Like, I would expect my son to have, to
be a
facilitate the having babies in that woman. Yeah.
Right. But
so
I don't know why.
That's because of a general. Well, because I think that humans basically have a biological obligation, a familial obligation to perpetuate the bloodline. I think that people tend to find great fulfillment in life through children, and I think that basically, I don't know, I'm very family oriented in the sense that, like, even the reason I started like doing this YouTube thing is because I didn't think people were talking about families enough, and so I think that to order society in the way that best facilitates like access to like the families is the best. But as far as like having kids, I mean, it's not like I would ostracize or condemn or try and change the mind of a daughter who didn't want to be a mother or something, but it's just one of those things where I would normally expect them to develop that on their own, and if they didn't, I'd be like, that's peculiar. But I don't know that I would try and put them through some sort of series of lectures or PowerPoint presentations on why they should have children. So I guess it would be an expectation, but it wouldn't be enforced.
You don't think you would enforce it?
I would never enforce someone to have a child. I think that's called
rape. That's not what I mean. See, I find the idea of enforcement not to be necessarily a cognizant thing. Like, I don't think it's a thing that people think.
You think that just
that they're necessarily doing
expectation that they're going to be inclined,
right? Setting an expectation, yeah.
Okay.
So setting the expectation that, like, yeah, you like football. You're wearing a Chiefs hat. I like football too. Like setting the expectation that our respective sons ought to share that hobby, even if we don't say we expect it. Mm-hmm. It's like, come over here, son, watch football. It's America's game. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're still going to inform the child an expectation on them, and that's kind of what you can't avoid.
Was that what you were getting at when you were like expressing anything as sort of forcing it on a kid?
I don't believe it's forcing it. I just believe it is an expectation. It becomes an expectation. Like, force is kind of a strong word. It's a lived experience that that you kind of adopt as an expectation on yourself because you see your people in your area doing the thing, and they look and act and call you by the same thing, man. And it becomes a societal expectation. And that's how these things perpetuate. And I'm not saying that football is necessarily a toxic thing to enjoy. I think it's an absolutely fine game, and I'm sure, and you can argue about the ethics of football and violence and all that shit if you want. But insofar as having a hobby and enjoying it with somebody, entertainment's not a bad thing. But there can be toxic things that go along with things like that. And it's just important to understand that, like, we don't engage in that toxicity. So if, for instance, your son doesn't like football, it's not like, what are you, some kind of girl? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
where that does happen. And I know that we both know people who either act like that or their fathers did or something like that, where they just had, like, it was just shit for them. And so, like, it leads people to leading unhealthy lives. And so getting away from from gender expectation necessarily seems to improve people's ability to find happiness in things sort of more naturally, rather than in a sort of peer pressure mode or a pressure from a parental.
How do you think, like, as a parent, like, for example, if I'm a parent and I just sort of assume that my daughter is at some point going to want to have kids, how do I make sure that doesn't, like, how do I know whether or not it's because of me or because of her that if she
well, yeah, it's a totally innocent thing, and it's not weird. Like it's not like, again, I'm not saying that if you were like, oh, someday you're gonna be a mommy, like, you're a bad person, right? Like, that's not what I'm saying. So it's just one of those things where, as they grow, it's like important to check yourself in regards to different expectations you might be accidentally placing on a child. You might be like, oh, someday you're gonna have kids just like me, aren't you? And then later, and then you might check yourself and be like, unless that's not a thing that you want to do, of course. Like, I know kids that I taught for a while were like, I'm gonna be a mommy someday, and it's like, it's kind of weird. Like I understand that some people are like, oh, that's cute, look at them play with the baby doll, but also they're like not of procreative age and should not and have not considered any of the aspects that go into having a family or making a family or being pregnant or any of that shit. So it's just one of those things where, as long as you try to be as even-handed and as supporting as possible of the kid and what they actually want to do, and making sure having real conversations with your kids, like, hey, maybe your kid's gay, so what's it like? Like, I'm not gay. Me and your mom love each other very much. How does it feel? Like, just having, like, if you don't know, asking. I think that's a really good tool for a parent, is to talk to their kids like that. Because when you're taught to teach kids that aren't your kids, you are taught to communicate with them in a way that they view you as an authority figure. You're not supposed to give away authority in the classroom, but like a peer that they can talk to in a way that maybe you won't talk about their sex life, but like, unless it's sex ed, but, talking in an honest fashion that is a safe place for them to be. Because as an educator, you're supposed to provide a safe place. I have a similar philosophy with parenting on a much more personal level, where you should provide a safe and open place for someone to be themselves, and whatever that person manifests into, as long as they're not harming anybody else and they're getting consent for all their actions, that is a person I want to exist. That, I mean, whatever way that manifests. If that person has a penis and wears dresses, great. If that person is just exactly like me, we're probably not going to get along, but great. Like that's, I don't know how to be against just who a person is. It doesn't make sense to me.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of follows from what we talked about earlier with your view of morality, basically being like consent based, or as long as like this individual is not harming anybody, they're not harming themselves explicitly, and they're just kind of being who they are, then it's like it's a-okay from the eyes of you as this hypothetical parent.
Right, because I don't view I think this probably comes back to a sin, right? You would probably identify homosexuality as a sin.
It is, but that's not why I'm against homosexuality fundamentally.
Well, I would expect it's at least orbiting the core of the reason, because you would then view it as them harming themselves.
Not because it's like sin and they're going to perish in hell or whatever. I think that the practice of it is unhealthy for human bodies.
What's wrong with two ladies?
Not necessarily the two ladies. I'm speaking more particularly to sodomy and male intercourse.
Okay, so what do you have ethically against lesbians?
Nothing in particular.
So only gay guys?
Well,
because they sometimes fuck butts.
Well, it's not sometimes. I think it's like 86% of them have engaged in it within the last year. But the problem with
how many straight people have engaged in it?
No, again, that's a fair point. It's absolutely a fair point. So the thing that I'm saying, though, is that my problem with it isn't necessarily just because it's religious. I just think that to participate in that act is bad because, for example, I think it's 4,000%. That's right. Because what happens is if you're depositing seminal fluid into areas that are not the female body, those genes or that information, what's it called? It's called macroorganisms. Hold on, what is that called? It contains information that basically can only be received by the female body. What is it? Immunoregulatory macromolecules. And so basically what happens is that sends out signals that only the female body can interpret. And so when those are deposited elsewhere, they're not only like misunderstood, but they cause the sperm to fuse with whatever somatic body cell that they can encounter. And so what that does is it actually causes the development of cancerous malignancies. And so that's why anal cancer is like 4,000% more likely to manifest in someone that like frequently engages in like anal sex versus someone like that doesn't. So it's just sort of not necessarily I'm against it because it's like, oh, I have this particular worldview as enforced by this. I just think that it's an unhealthy lifestyle. And so I would hope that, you know, if I had a son that was heterosexual and he was like, hey, Dad, me and my girlfriend did anal, I'd be like, wow, all right, big guy. I hope you don't have cancer. Or I don't know if she doesn't have cancer. I don't know. I'm not going to make an assumption based on who would be receiving in that, but you kind of get what I'm saying. And it's not only the cancerous aspect of it. Like if you look at the sexual behavior in the gay community, it's much different than the way, and I don't know if you actually, we didn't really touch on this, or we didn't really clarify rather, how much of Psych you actually subscribe to, but I'm actually fascinated by the sexual behavior in gay couples in the sense that you can actually sort of see in theory, like if we look at, do you acknowledge the differences between male and female attraction, or do you think that those are basically the same?
What do you mean?
Like what men are attracted to, their sexual behavior, what women are attracted to, their sexual behavior. Do you think those are fundamentally the same, or do you think they're different?
Give me an example.
Okay, so we know that in women, as I cited earlier, like their most preferred, or actually this would be a better example because it's for behavior. In both sexes cross-culturally, the most reported trait that is attractive, not necessarily attribute, but like a trait is fidelity. When men can get it, they would prefer chastity. But in some countries, like in Northern European countries, for example, where the women have become economically liberated, they don't necessarily preserve their virginities. And so it's still fidelity in that case. So like being attracted to fidelity in that sense, or even like men with the fat distribution with like hip to waist ratio, like or even the preference for casual or short-term versus like long-term relationships, how women tend to want more long-term, men tend to want more short-term.
I don't, is that necessarily like like scientifically proven? This seems a lot like self-reporting. Like
no, the guy's name was David Buss. He pioneered the field of Psych, and I think it's really interesting information. But
how old is that study? When did that come out?
That particular textbook is still being updated. I assumed it came out.
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, like even if there are general predispositions for people's attraction, I don't.
What I'm saying is basically that because we know that in heterosexual relationships, males tend to be very interested in like short-term encounters if they can get it. What we would expect then in the gay community is like not a lot of long-term encounters or not a lot of monogamy, and basically like.
So would you find that a societal or biological imperative?
For gay men.
For like heterosexual men finding short-term sexual gratification.
I think that it is a biological factor that is we need to basically be controlled in order to have civilized society.
Okay.
And so that's why I'm kind of interested in the behavior of gay men, because that's exactly what we find, like as far as the percentage of them who have had like over 500 sex partners. Like there was one study in San Francisco.
Oh, I see.
So yeah,
So a part of those studies are informed by a couple things. So you would expect a person who has to hide themselves to not be able to have long-term relationships. You wouldn't be able to take your boyfriend out in public. You wouldn't be able to take your boyfriend home.
That's not what I'm talking about right now. I'm just talking about like the casual sexual encounters.
Right. This causes casual sexual encounters.
1 second, just to let you guys know, we'll go to Q&A soon. Go ahead, Jake.
Okay. How long? What time?
Like hopefully
Up to you.
within 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay. We'll call it 8:50.
Deal.
Okay. So you would expect, if someone can't in society normally have an everyday relationship, that they would be prone to having short-term relationships, maybe one-night stands. This happens all the time, especially in the past in the gay community. It has been declining since we have been able to have marriage and since we have destigmatized being homosexual. This happens a lot. And if you couple the fact that you agree that that men have a biological predisposition to kind of just like spread their seed around.
Yeah.
If your sexuality is homosexuality, isn't to reproduce. And I mean, I have no interest in reproducing when I fuck. I don't know what you do at this point in your life, but when I bang, it's because it feels good. It's because it's a thing I like. It's because I have an urge. And so if you still have that urge, but you are attracted to people without vaginas, necessarily in this case where they're cis gay dudes, yeah, you would expect those things to coalesce into one, where they both have to hide and not be able to pursue long-term relationships in public, and have to find these little spaces where there's a lot of men out there that are in the closet that can't express themselves, mostly due to societal pressure and where they live, and the fact that there's a stigma at all on it. So men who are pent sexually up, yeah, you would expect them to have more sex. I mean, yes.
Right. So yeah, that's the problem, is what I was saying, is because the act in itself, like that particular act.
So it's only a problem if you push them to the margins. It becomes less of a problem as they are more normalized. Well, I mean, the data just shows that.
I don't know about that one. As far as the longevity,
it has been the number of sexual partners overall for gay men has been declining since the 70s, as we have been destigmatizing gay relationships, basically.
I know that there was a book written in, I think, the early 2000s. I think it was called like Gay in America. It was written by these two gay guys. But one of the things that they pointed out was that heterosexual couples are 41 times more likely to be monogamous than homosexual couples. There was something like 156 couples that they surveyed, and only
and you probably
remained faithful.
And I'm assuming you find monogamy to be like a virtuous, ethical.
Yeah.
Yeah. While I am in a monogamous relationship and we are both monogamous, I have no ethical qualms with anyone that doesn't want that, right? So I can't think of an ethical reason to not, like, we're going to be moving away from monogamy as a whole in the future, I believe. We also have, again, talking about biological predilections, we have a biological predisposition to seek different mates after a short period of time.
Yeah, and I think that our society is basically founded on the backbone of society is basically founded upon fidelity in marriage, and controlling those urges. And then
I don't think you need. I don't think there's any like model that shows that you need marriage to have society.
Oh boy, here we go. That would be another distinction. I mean, when you think of society, what do you think of? How do you think society is composed?
People,
families, or people?
You can have families, absolutely. Like no one's anti-family necessarily. Some people might be anti-family, but not anti-family in that they would abolish other people from having families. I haven't met that person. That probably exists. Maybe there's a tanky out there who's also like no families, but
well, actually, a lot of the prominent second wave feminists wanted to completely abolish the family. There's a woman like Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler. They wrote about it because they thought that it would the woman would never be totally liberated unless the family unit was abolished.
Right. There's also political lesbians. I mean, there's some people on the fringes, absolutely.
Well, I don't know if those are fringe. I mean, these are the women.
You don't think of a political lesbian as a fringe person or someone?
No, I was talking about the people that I cited by name.
But
I kind of want to bring it back.
Well, hold on. No. I really do think that it's important to understand that person is a fringe person. There aren't a lot of feminists that think that you shouldn't have a family.
You're talking about Judith Butler and Simone de Beauvoir. You think they're fringe?
Sure, those are two people that absolutely believe that, and there's not a lot of feminists.
But you know that they authored books that basically carry the momentum of the movement throughout decades.
Well, sure, but that doesn't mean that's so there's other aspects to those books besides don't fucking have a family, dude.
Right, but that was a large aspect of it. So what I'm saying is that the movement is basically predicated upon those beliefs.
Due to the fact that those were patriarchal relationships, typically, usually you had the man just dictating what happened, and those were born out of the 50s and 60s and into the 70s and 80s. So like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense that they would have that perspective, of course.
They weren't actually dictating what happened. There was a study that was done, I believe, in early 1960s about like how day-to-day decisions are made in households.
Well, yeah, a 1960s study. Yeah, never mind.
And
yes.
It basically contradicted what you said in that it wasn't this idea that the men were dictating how everything went. It was basically that women made the day-to-day decisions, men made the bigger decisions.
The little decisions.
And then 80% of it and then 80% of the time they made I think it was like the big like drastic decisions like together or something like that. But I kind of wanted to bring it back to the point that I was trying to make as far as the health implications of engaging in anal sex. My point was basically that because the act in itself is much more likely, increasing the risk of rectal prolapse, viral hepatitis B and C, syphilis, chlamydia.
Okay, so I know that you're against, like you're for like a porn ban. Are you also for like a cigarettes, alcohol ban and stuff like that?
I wouldn't say a ban.
You might have to give Jake the last word here coming up, just because you had kind of made that case there, John, on the health concerns that you had, and just to go to Q&A soon.
Well, I just want to know how that extrapolates. Like, do you find other things that are health concerns that need to be? We should as a society be like, don't do that. It's bad. You should be ashamed for doing that.
I think that the society should have a standard of what is good derived from what helps people flourish. And I don't think that cigarette smoking, alcohol consumption, or sodomy are within that framework.
So do you think that cigarettes or gay butt sex kill more people? Pick one and then we can go.
You'd be surprised. You would actually be surprised. I kid you not.
Cigarettes, not gay sex, chat.
I kid you not. Per capita.
It's per capita, it's cigarettes.
It's literally not.
It is. More people die from cigarettes than die from fucking their asses.
I was talking about per capita. Pretty sure I had this.
Per capita.
Bruh.
Let's see. This might be a chance to go into the Q&A if you guys are okay with that. We do have it's a challenge. Normally I'd honestly let this go for like 4 hours because it's honestly one of the most enjoyable things to get to listen to. It's been a really interesting debate and a lot of brain power up here. It's just that we do have a debate scheduled coming up still, so I do want to run through. So folks, please forgive me if I don't get to every question. I'm going to try to go through everyone, but please help me out by not asking anymore. I'm sorry. But quick one, Spike Smith, thanks for your question. They said, Doyle, why do non-gender sex conforming people have to justify their existence or experience to you or anybody?
It's not that they have to justify their experience to me. The problem is that they're justifying the experience to the whole society and then making the society align with their framework. So it's not that they're just saying, I want to live by myself and I want to behave in a certain way. They're literally legislating compelled speech laws that will force me to use their pronouns that are not in line with reality. And also the idea that there's a private life and a public life is sort of not true, because everything that you do in your private life in some capacity is going to influence what you do in your public life. And so like what we've seen is like in New York City, or New York City rather, you can be fined $250,000 if you intentionally misgender somebody. To me, I mean, again, you'd have to prove like whether or not it was intentional or not. So it's not about you justifying your existence to me. It's you justifying your existence to the society, even though you actually are not in line with your existence, which is the whole problem. And now you're going to try and force my children in public schools to accept that as something that's normal, when, I mean, he rejects my data, but he failed to provide data that proved in his point that like this research is normal or this research is good or whatever. And I think it's a dangerous thing to be cementing to our children, because of the research that I have shows that kids that go down this rabbit hole, they don't come back. And then the suicide rate is like 41% on average as far as the attempted rate. So
that statistic is wrong. Also, the in regards to the law in New York that you are citing, it is not illegal to misgender someone. It is illegal to harass someone, and repeated misgendering is one of the circumstances under which you can be considered harassing someone. This would have to be held up in a court of law, of course. It's not just you if you go, hey dude, and they're like, I'm a lady, you don't get $143,000 fine. So anyway, also Bill C-16 still has no arrests. I'm just tossing that out there for any Jordan Peterson fans.
We just to move on. Forgive me, John. I know it's tough. I know I'm confident you have a response, but just to keep moving. Gravity Axe, thanks for your question. They said, what's wrong with the term transgenders?
It's not like wrong. It's just crass. It's like calling it's like calling it's like calling them the blacks. You know what I mean? Like, it has, look at those Jews. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like Indians. It's, you don't call people those things, right? It's just a little crass. It's like not. It's not. I mean, you can. There's just a higher social cost to it. It's not as bad as saying some things that you can say. It's not even necessarily a slur. It's just incorrect, and it's not like, call people whatever you want. But when someone goes, why are you saying transgenders? You sound old. Like, it's just because that's not the current terminology that people like to use. And some people feel dehumanized by it.
You bet. Thanks very much. Jonathan L., thanks for your question. They said, within activity circles and the media and universities, the word cis man is used as a derogatory term. All other identities are elevated. They ask, why is this to both of you?
Why is it that they're identical? Okay. Basically, the identity of the cis man, which has no basis, maybe older than, I don't know, 10 years ago, that cannot exist on the same platform as the other, I guess, identities that are being promoted, because those identities that are being promoted are new identities, and they seek to basically erode the fabric of society as we know it, as far as objectivity is concerned. So there is no longer like men or women or males or females or whatever. There is cis males or cis women, stuff like that. And so the reason that cis men as a demographic tend to be the target, I mean, if you even want to get into like the straight white male problem, is because we tend to be more conservative and we tend to be opposing this. And so logically speaking, we would be the target. We would be ostracized and marginalized and whatnot.
Do you feel marginalized?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are still sexes in men and women and all that shit. There's just also ways to describe oneself that is more accurate, right? So you could just say, I'm a man and I'm a male. Like, you could just say that about me and that would be accurate, and that's totally fine. But when talking about gender as a concept, it's much more useful as language to say I am a cis man rather than I am a trans man, because we are talking about trans issues, right? And eventually it might become more useful just to use cis in general. It might be more useful to display your pronouns just for ease of use. It might be a situation where people, it just becomes normal to greet one another with pronoun usage. You might find this cumbersome, but if the language and the society dictates that this is just the most useful way to go about stuff, we're all just going to do it the same way that we didn't necessarily think we were all going to text all the time. We end up doing that too. Like society changes with times and speed and the way we want to talk to one another and how we describe different things. It seems to be kind of flailing. It's a similar phenomenon to when as the country becomes less religious, there tends to be this louder and louder evangelical minority that are like, we used to have the Westboro Baptist that was really, really strong for a while. There just seems to be a very large wailing against people misinterpreting the idea of including other identities as a way of excluding other people. I am a cis, white, straight dude. These are all the things that you consider to be attacked. I am never attacked for these things, because you're not being attacked for those traits inherently. It's not like someone goes, white. I mean, someone probably might do that, but these communities are supporting me and other people like me because there is also an advocacy and an understanding that I accept you because it's not a big deal. It's just who you are. I'm not bucking against it. People go, oh, look, another cis white guy saying how a trans person feels, like, because that's what happens all the time, because cis white guys represent largely, proportionally, or not proportionally, like abnormally high numbers of the people that are in charge of these different institutions, and the people that tend to represent their different experiences of oppression. And so, like, yeah, of course they would bring that up, because it's like yet another person all the time doing this thing. It's the same thing that, like, I don't know, never mind. I was gonna make I was gonna make you mad. Never mind.
Posadas John, thanks for your question. They said treating diaspora was originally to change the mind.
Do you mean dysphoria?
Yeah, that
I think it's dysphoria.
It is spelled diaspora, but I
diaspora.
think you're right.
Okay, yeah, no, it's probably.
I think
dysphoria.
You're right. It means dysphoria. Sorry about that, Posadas John.
Good.
They said treating dysphoria was originally to change the mind, and it led to lobotomies, electroshock, drugging people up on lithium. What Doyle is suggesting has been tried and was a failure.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
Epic. No, I mean, that's just like, it's one of those things. They do this a lot with intelligence research. Oh, this practice was used once bad, therefore any attempt to use it is always bad. Literally, with the plan, the
What you
policy
say about
prescription,
current transition therapy? Okay.
the policy prescription, which I explicitly laid out in my perfect world, was not one of lobotomies for those who are dysphoric or whatever. I literally said that these people need to have therapy that affirms the existence of biological sex. Also, I did want to make one point about evolving language. This idea that sex and gender are separate linguistically is very new. Sex and gender have always meant the same thing. I mean, the Latin and Greek root for gen means to produce, to birth, generation, genesis, whatever. Endure involves the separation or splitting of skin or leather. Dermatologist, taxidermist. So like combined, it literally means to possess the capacity to reproduce as one or the other gender. So this idea that Jake is kind of pushing, like, oh, it's just evolving naturally, blah, blah, blah. You know, we just have to go with the flow. It sort of ignores the fact that there are like people on his movement, like advocating for this to happen. And if we are resisting, we are, you know, like the reactionaries, literally speaking. And so the idea that this is occurring naturally within the psyche of the culture, I think, is just demonstrably false.
Do you not find societal movements to be natural?
I think that natural in the sense that they're naturally occurring would be a bit misleading. I think that there are people who are working day in and day out to have these trends occur to advance their own ideology.
We do have a question for you, Jake. I know there's been a lot of them for John so far. They asked, Comic Curie, thanks for your question. They said, do you not think that teens will identify with an illness for attention? Why is it that transgenderism is exploding at such a rate? Was it really the case 5 years ago that 15% of teens were transgender?
Why do I think it's exploding at a rate? So first of all, there's like kind of two questions here. The first question is kind of like, what about trans trenders? Like, I'm not willing to, this is kind of like, if you're pro-gun, like, it's kind of like, why would you let one maniac with a gun ruin it for the rest of us? You know what I mean? Like, if you make that argument about guns, you literally cannot make this argument in regards to gender. You just can't, because it's the same fucking thing. It's just someone not shooting anybody and only affecting themselves. It's even better. So the second part is, why do I think that we're having more people be open about being transgender? It's because it's becoming more societally normalized. There's probably a little bit of an overcorrection as well. You're going to get, it's not just teens, by the way. It's just people across all ages coming out as trans. So you're going to see a spike in the jump when the conversation turns to normalization and being like, hey, by the way, you're valid if you're trans, and you are if you're trans. Like, I don't know, like if you're experiencing any sort of like questions about your gender, or if you just have questions about other people's gender and you have no questions about yourselves, I would love to talk to you about that, because I find it incredibly interesting. Yeah, I think it's something that should be celebrated. And you know, not disproportionately. Like, it's right now, today, it could be tough to be trans. It can be tough to come out and be trans. So those people need support, and eventually, hopefully, the idea is that those people won't need to be hoisted up and built up by a community, and they'll just be normal everyday parts of our lives, and we can move on to the next social issue, whatever that is. People wanting to fuck robots or something, I don't know. And like, if there's no ethical problem with it, which I can't think of one, then let's go with that. Like, so again, I guess just to basically answer the question, the explosion that you're you think you're experiencing is really just people that were in the closet that are no longer in the closet. They were always trans.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, we only have a couple more here. Let's see. General Ballsack. That's their real name. Sorry. PapaBird, they say, why do you dismiss others' anecdotal stories when you use them all the time to justify your position?
I think I only used like 2 anecdotal stories, and I immediately said that one definitely does not involve any sort of factual basis. It was just interesting. But no, I don't dismiss all anecdotal stories. I dismiss them in regards to the broader context. Like if you want to bring up like, oh, I played with dolls as a boy. Didn't you play with dolls as a boy? That's just me and John talking about our experiences as cis men in regards to a discussion about being cis and being boys and what we would expect to socialize in, right? So that's not an anecdote necessarily. And the anecdote that I tend to reject is I have this specific example of this person who detransitioned, and we're not talking about the experience of detransitioning. We're talking about the invalidation of transitioning, right? That isn't the vast majority of people that transition are fine with it and they enjoy it. And it makes them happier, and their dysphoria is mitigated, or even they could have gender euphoria at that point because they're so happy to be the person they've always meant to be. So, I mean, yeah, it's it's not a dismissal of anecdotes. It just depends on the context of the anecdotes, and maybe it's because this person asking the question doesn't like do a lot of like debates or whatever. So it just depends on the context. Anecdotes can be useful. John used several anecdotes that were useful to the conversation throughout to describe kind of how he feels about family, how he feels about being a man, how he feels about ethics and religion, stuff like that. And those anecdotes are totally fine to give a broader context of how someone is feeling in regards to a broader sort of conversation when we're talking about how do you feel about X, but not in disproving a concept is bad, if that makes sense.
You bet. Thanks very much.
Can I respond to that?
If it's short and pithy, please.
Short and that other word. Just to clarify, the employment of the anecdotes pertaining to people that had gone through detransitioning wasn't to make an assertion as to proportion that go through it. It was just to point out that those people, and you can go on YouTube and type in these stories, basically they all tend to say the same things, report the same trends of like, we were pressured into this, the diagnosis was incorrect, and now we have lifelong effects of it, like whether it's like the young woman who for example, who approached me at that speech, her voice is like permanently lower now because of it. And so that was just to kind of say that if you go and you hear these people's stories, like you can watch them on YouTube, you'll read the comments and people think that those stories are inherently transphobic because they go against the cause that is being advanced by these activists. So
right, but you can find the same stories that say the exact opposite. So I mean, like they're about as useful, right? Like, I don't think you would be like, if I saw some YouTube videos where trans people were like super pumped, you'd be like, well, that doesn't matter. Here's this. You know what I mean? So like they're kind of useless in this context.
I think it's just alarming that they're all just like coincidentally reporting that like their stories have been like suppressed and they were pressured into this sort of thing. So I'm sure like in that case, maybe that is what those people needed. And then of course they're going to be reporting positive things about it. But these people just tend to be reporting that their experience was negative and they were coerced into it by these doctors and by these therapists. So that's kind of like my whole concern with this whole issue is people that are not in fact gender dysphoric being coerced into it, not only by the ideology, but by these experts and by their parents and the sort of neo-gender theories. So that's been basically my big problem with it.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Last one real quick. And also do want to mention, folks, if you're thirsty for more, we'll have a debate on are there scientific errors in the Quran right after this with Dr. Jonathan McClatchy, as well as a brand new guest. And also, let's see, Kamakiri, thanks for your question. They asked, what's the panel's position on transgenders in sport?
Transgenders
Sorry,
in
no, that's...
sport. Yeah, I mean, I have no ethical problem with it. A lot of people use combat sports as sort of an example here because they're like, men are beating up ladies. It's up to the individual sporting thing, whether it be, one of the major 4 sports in the United States, Olympics, whatever. A lot of these has been testing for testosterone levels and weight class and stuff forever. So usually when people are starting to have debates about this, they're talking about like high school wrestler beats up ladies. It's
Gotcha.
usually that.
Thank you very much. And John, if you'd like to, you don't have to answer, but if you want to, you can as well.
I would say that I think the reason that we have sports and other activities segregated by sex is because that there are inherent differences between biological men and biological women, and your gender identity existing independently of that, or so they claim, has no effect on that. And so I think that they should remain segregated. I don't see a reason why they shouldn't.
It does after you start transitioning, absolutely.
What do you mean?
Well, so someone taking estrogen, for example, would not be, especially with the hormone blockers that you usually take during transition, you would have lower testosterone than your average cis female. So
we will next wrap up and say, folks, I want to remind you, both of our speakers, I wish we could keep going forever. This has been so fun. Both of the speakers have their links in the description. I put them there so that if you enjoyed what you heard tonight, you can find more content at their links below. So it's been a great time. I want to say thanks so much to our guests just for being here, you guys. It's been awesome to have you.
Yes.
So as well, everybody out there, thanks for hanging out with us. It's been a pleasure, whether you be Republican, Democrat, no matter where you are in terms of beliefs or orientation or whatever it is. We want to let you know that we really do hope you feel welcome here. We're glad you're hanging out, and we hope you have a great rest of your night if we don't see you at the next one. Take care, folks.
I'm streaming right now.